You've been feeling tired, haven't you? If you're ready, we might go along now.
You really come down to any large story that interests people, can hold them attention for a considerable time, or make the stories practically always, a human story is practically always about one thing, aren't they? Death. The inevitability of death.
J.R.R. Tolkien posited that the most powerful stories, and those with the greatest staying power among audiences, share one central element, a confrontation with the inevitability of death. And while his fellow English author Richard Adams may not necessarily have agreed, the latter two's most acclaimed and enduring works certainly don't dispute Tolkien's words. Richard Adams' own journey as an author mirrored Tolkien's in several ways. Both were raised among the idyllic countryside of rural England, studied at the prestigious Oxford University, and were confronted with unspeakable horrors while losing numerous friends in the devastation of war. But for Adams, who despite serving all across the globe during and after the Second World War, was fortunate enough to have never come under enemy fire himself, the most traumatic experience occurred upon his return home. Having come back to Oxford's Worcester College to complete his degree in modern history, the then 26-year-old Adams casually asked a faculty member whether or not his other friends had resumed their studies yet, only to receive a somber, non-committal response. Directed to another department, he provided the name of his closest friend, Alastair Christison, only to learn that Alastair had been killed in combat. Still reeling from the shock, Adams went on to inquire about his other friends, only to learn, one by one, that nearly every one of them had been killed as well. Alastair was dead. Frank Schumer was dead. William Brown was dead. Mike Seal was dead. Roby Revnell was dead. Cullen Powell, Jim Sharp, and Frank Savory were dead. I could mention others, but will not, since their names have not previously come into this book. The total number, however, was grievous indeed. Reflecting on this nearly half a century later in his memoir, The Day Gone By, Adams would explain, "It is hard to find any appropriate way in which to write about this experience, the worst experience of my life, and one which has altered my outlook of the world from that time to this. The shock took time to enter me deeply, but of course it has remained of permanent effect. You don't feel lucky, really. You feel guilty to be alive, and always full of bitter regret. About once or twice a year, more or less, I dream that Alastair is alive. If he were to return now, of course, he would be a boy considerably younger than my own daughters. He was 23. They were all about that age, or less. The passage of years has made no difference." Adams would go on to complete his degree, marry the love of his life, father 2 children, and work for more than 2 decades as a member of the British Civil Service before turning to literature. But his encounter with mortality never truly left him, and this can be seen in his writings. His 2 greatest works, Watership Down and The Plague Dogs, would both be adapted into animated films by Martin Rosen's Nepenthe Productions. And while the novels differ significantly from both each other and their adaptations, both they and the films they inspired easily rank among the masterpieces of their respective media, and share their central elements: a confrontation with the fragility of life, and a questioning approach to the suffering inherent in existence. The primroses were over. With the opening lines of Watership Down, Richard Adams establishes a sense of things passing away, describing the flowering primrose plants common to rural England losing their petals as their seasonal life cycle progresses with the advent of summer. Towards the edge of the wood, where the ground became open and sloped down to an old fence and a brambly ditch beyond, only a few fading patches of yellow still showed among the dog's mercury and oak tree roots. In doing so, he establishes a central element of the story, that of the fragility of the natural world, with an emphasis on the cyclical nature of existence. Standing in stark contrast to the view of history which has dominated Western thought for much of the prior millennium, this cyclical worldview was generally espoused by ancient thinkers and cultures, asserting that the natural course of existence was one of gradual repetition, of a series of cycles rather than of linear progression. This thinking can be seen in not only Greek and Mesopotamian mythology, but also in indigenous Central American calendars, Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, and many pre-Christian European pagan practices. Born into an upper-middle-class family in 1920, as Europe was only just beginning to recover from the devastation wrought by the First World War, Richard Adams attended an English boarding school as part of his upbringing, before moving on to Oxford's Worcester College. There, he received an extensive education in Greco-Roman classics, his appreciation for which is easily identifiable in his debut. This culturally rich schooling aided greatly in his efforts to transpose the mythic nature and timeless appeal of the works he so loved into a contemporary story told through the eyes of such an unassuming species. His prose evokes at once the grace of Wordsworth and the stoicism of Homer, and yet retains a rustic, folksy charm, complemented by a sly, almost irreverent undercurrent. Encountering certain lines, one can nearly imagine a grandfatherly Adams winking at his audience as he reads before a gathered crowd, the pages lit by a flickering fireplace. But those tempted to dismiss Adams' novel as merely a retelling of the Odyssey with rabbits miss several key aspects that serve to distinguish his Lapine epic from its influences. While Watership Down certainly does draw on the works of Homer, it is far from a simple retread of any one classical work. The journey of Hazel's band through the English countryside naturally evokes the adventurous tone of the Odyssey, but their flight from the doomed warren at Sandalford has a much clearer parallel to Aeneas and his companions' escape from Troy at the beginning of the Aeneid. And the Ephraim siege of Watership Down itself mirrors the climax of the Iliad, only to feature the defenders snatching victory from the jaws of certain defeat. Even the epigram to the first chapter of Adams' novel, the notice board, features an ominous excerpt from Aeschylus's tragic play Agamemnon, in which the king's concubine Cassandra, the archetypal foundation for the character of Fiver, prophesies destruction. Why do you cry out thus, unless at some vision of horror? The house reeks of death and dripping blood. How so? 'Tis but the odor of the altar sacrifice. The stench is like a breath from the tomb. Additionally, by telling his story from the perspective of rabbits living in then-present-day England, Adams focuses the attention of readers on their own domineering position within the natural world. The roles of the gods and monsters that toy with and torment Odysseus and his men on their journey home are filled here by ordinary humans, automobiles and roadways, domestic dogs and common machinery. In this way, the familiar, tame environment known to most of us is inverted into a terrifying wilderness fraught with danger, a rugged frontier overlapping the tranquil countryside our own eyes see. And the use of the rabbit, an animal nearly universally preyed upon by the predatory species whose habitat it shares, whose surest methods of fighting back are not ferocity or strength, but cunning and agility, only serves to elevate the mortality-centered philosophy that infuses the entire novel. But despite its classical influences and romantic trappings, Watership Down is a distinctly modernist novel, condemning the destructive tendencies of humanity as a species, skeptical of narratives that equate civilization's advance with unambiguous progress, possessing deep reverence for the natural world, and interested in exploring differing societal systems. After all, the novel's inciting incident stems from a callous decision by humans to clear more land for yet another housing development, showing no regard for the lesser species with whom they share the world, a narrative choice that undoubtedly connected with conservationist concerns of the time. And the story's most unique attribute, that being, of course, that the novel is told from the perspective of wild rabbits, adds numerous elements of depth and subtext. Adams' choice of characters for a modernized epic openly flaunting its classical inspirations may, at first, strike the casual observer as odd. Why would anyone choose to tell, or be interested in, an epic story about rabbits? If he were to choose a non-human species, some might be inclined to wonder, why not select one known for its ferocity or cunning, one who might hold more appeal to readers and have less connotations of childishness and weakness? But Adams' use of rabbits is fundamental to the story he tells for two reasons. The first is symbolic. Today, if you ask people what rabbits symbolize, most will likely be quick to answer with something along the lines of fertility or fecundity, as rabbits are perhaps best known for their ability to reproduce quickly. But the reason that the species evolution has favored an R-selection strategy, where large numbers of offspring are produced and rapidly grow to maturity, is because of their vulnerability, as while wild rabbits are equipped with claws and teeth, and are capable of fighting to defend themselves, they are nearly universally hunted prey. Historically, the rabbit has served as a symbol of mortality, of the vulnerability of all living creatures and the fragility of life itself, symbolism which manages to persist, albeit in a limited manner, to this day. Take, for instance, one of the opening lines to Pink Floyd's existentialist masterpiece, The Dark Side of the Moon, from the track Breathe. As Roger Waters' melancholic lyrics lament the unrelenting demands of life, he sings the line, "Run, rabbit, run, dig that hole, forget the sun, and when at last the work is done, don't sit down, it's time to dig another one." The image of a rabbit, ceaselessly fleeing and burrowing, constantly pursued until it succumbs to either predation or exhaustion, is at once both disturbing and evocative of the nature of all life, requiring constant maintenance to delay its inevitable cessation. This imagery is mirrored in the short, prayer-like utterance that Adam's rabbits invoke upon the death of a companion. "My heart has joined the 1,000, for my friend stopped running today." The other reason Adam's choice of species matters is that it completely recontextualizes our otherwise familiar world. Richard Adams could quite easily have told his story with physically anthropomorphized rabbits and other woodland creatures, as was common in many classic English children's tales. But in framing the story through the eyes of wild rabbits living in a very real rural England, he introduces new layers of subtext and depth to what might otherwise appear to be a relatively standard story. For the wild rabbit, death potentially lurks behind every tuft of grass or drifting cloud, and actions that seem mundane to human beings, such as fording a stream or crossing a farm road, bring with them a very real chance of dying. Thus the familiar, seemingly tame and idyllic English countryside, where every mile has been charted, mapped, and cultivated or developed, where the bear and wolf have been eradicated for the better half of a millennium, where the most a human might ever have to fear is a rabid dog or fox, becomes an uncharted wilderness teeming with savage predators. And while rabbits are physically capable of defending themselves, being equipped with powerful back legs, claws, and teeth, they lack the fortitude to stand up against the vast majority of their predators, with their evolutionary instincts driving them to either freeze or flee rather than fight. Where classic human epics nearly always feature heroes who utilize strength and bravery to triumph over their foes in addition to clever tricks, rabbits are left only with the latter. And this shows in the culture that Adams crafted to imbue his narrative with a sense of being lived in. In a brazenly unique addition to the genre of animal literature, rather than try to portray his rabbit characters in a strictly realistic manner, Adams took the radical approach of constructing for them a thoroughly realized culture, complete with its own social structures, religion and myths, and even language, attempting to envision how all of this might have organically formed within the constraints of their pre-technology existence near the bottom of the food chain. Adam's rabbits don't merely live in communal warrens, they exist within class structures whose strictness can vary wildly between communities. Individual chiefs, or in some cases councils, command auslas, castes which serve their leaders as guards, advisors, and military and police forces, while in warrens with sizable populations, outskirters are forced to dwell and forage on the fringes of the community. The rabbits play games of bobstones to pass the time, distinguish between carnivorous birds and their non-threatening counterparts as hawks and not hawks, and label any quantity above 5 as hrer, literally many, being unable to count higher. The rabbits even possess their own language, which we see bits and pieces of throughout the narrative when appropriate. Words which lack a straightforward translation in human languages are provided to the reader in Lapine. For instance, the term for emerging above ground to feed, something human languages do not require a single word for, is rendered as silflay, while Ilil translates to all predators that hunt rabbits. And in sparingly utilizing footnotes where certain aspects of rabbit language or quirks of their culture may need further explaining to the audience, Adams gives the story of Watership Down a sense of being a real epic from a long-existing culture that has only just recently been discovered and translated by human scholars. And, perhaps most importantly, the rabbits of Watership Down share a complex cycle of folklore and religious beliefs. Their worship of the life-giving sun as the benevolent yet stern Frith feels eminently appropriate for a herbivorous species, while the Black Rabbit of Inlay is tasked with shepherding the souls of the departed to the mysterious land of Moonrise. The trickster hero El Herrera, the prince with 1,000 enemies, is held up as the shining ideal of rabbit kind, a sort of cross between Adam, Abraham, Robin Hood, and Reynard the Fox, at once the father of their people, a wartime leader, the source of their plight, and an unabashed rogue who never shies from using the most underhanded means of trickery to escape danger, outwit his foes, and benefit his own kin. El Herrera is the most revered figure in rabbit culture, being esteemed as the epitome of their kind, an arrogant, brazen liar and unabashed rogue who is perfectly content to steal, cheat, and even kill, often through very underhanded means, those who stand against him and his people. This gives us insight into the values of Adam's rabbits, who have little room for conceptions of honor or a fair fight. The scales of the world having already been tipped against their kind, they must use every manner of trickery and deceit to even have a chance at surviving. Similarly insightful is the name with which the rabbits address the sun god, Frith, an Old English word for the peace of the natural order, which can be considered more akin to balance than an outright lack of violence. As herbivores, it makes sense that the ultimate source of light, which not only nourishes their food but allows them to spot their myriad enemies more clearly, is revered as a deity. But Frith is not seen as solely benevolent. In the Lapine creation myth, the god Frith creates the world, and then peoples it with all manner of animal species, making them all herbivorous and allowing them to live in peace. El Herrera, the prince of rabbits, fathers more children than any other species, and in time his people begin to inadvertently starve the others by consuming all of the available resources. When warned against continuing down this path by Frith himself, the rabbit prince arrogantly proclaims that his people are the strongest in the world, at which point Frith bestows upon numerous other species various gifts, equipping them with sharp claws and vicious fangs, and imbuing them with a desire to hunt and kill the children of El Herrera to sustain themselves. As the rabbits are slaughtered by their newfound foes, and El Herrera curses his changing fortunes, his own people receive a final set of divine gifts: powerful back legs and sensitive ears, a sleek, swift form, and the ability to burrow. And as the rabbit prince uses his newfound abilities to flee, Frith's words echo after him. El Herrera, your people cannot rule the world, for I will not have it so. All the world will be your enemy, prince with 1,000 enemies, and whenever they catch you, they will kill you. But first they must catch you. Digger, listener, runner, prince with the swift warning. Be cunning and full of tricks, and your people will never be destroyed. The most crucial part of Frith's promise is this: whenever they catch you, they will kill you. But first they must catch you. It is not framed as a matter of if, but when, and the only hope for survival lies in flight and cunning, and the propagation of their people. Related to this is the place in the rabbit's mythology given to the Black Rabbit of Inlay, Inlay being the Lapine term for both the literal moon and the figurative land of Moonrise, the nebulous, shadowy realm of death. The Black Rabbit serves as a sort of Grim Reaper or Angel of Death for rabbit kind, supposedly deciding the time, place, and manner in which every creature will meet its appointed end.
We go by the will of the Black Rabbit. When he calls you, you have to go. Stay where you are.
In the folklore of Watership Down's rabbits, even El Herrera himself is subject to the power of the Black Rabbit, hinting at the idea that perhaps death is merely another facet of the life-giving Frith that the rabbits worship. In presenting the rabbit's creation story in this manner, Adams envisions how a pre-technology, pre-civilization culture that seems to exist merely as food for most of creation might try to rationalize their plight, much in the way that the biblical story of the temptation in Eden may be viewed as an exploration of the fallen, or vulnerable and corruptible, nature of mankind. Throughout the course of Watership Down, Adams mixes the tales of El Herrera and his companions into the narrative, with the group sharing stories that often parallel, and in some cases are drastically juxtaposed against, their own experiences. Certain rabbits, such as Fiver, the younger brother of the protagonist Hazel, are even blessed, or cursed, with mystical sight, able to sense things beyond natural perception and catch glimpses of the future, which, in the case of the novel, is what sets our heroes on the journey away from the doomed warren of Sandalford in southern England, the community condemned to destruction to make way for a human housing development. The novel itself begins in the quiet, tranquil wood of Sandalford in southern England, home to a thriving colony of rabbits. Among its inhabitants are 2 outskirters, or younger rabbits who dwell on the less secure fringes of the warren, having neither the familial connections nor physical strength to secure a more desired place in the hierarchy. Hazel, the primary protagonist, watches over his younger brother Fiver, the runt of their litter, who is both blessed and cursed with a mystical attunement, able to sense danger and death and glimpse visions of the future. While Hazel is introduced as shrewd and buoyant, capable of looking after himself, Fiver's introduction is characteristic of the death anxiety that permeates the story. His companion seemed less at ease. He was small, with wide, staring eyes and a way of raising and turning his head which suggested not so much caution as a kind of ceaseless, nervous tension. As the 2 forage on the edge of a field, they come across a newly erected signpost reeking of the stench of man. Here, Fiver succumbs to a vision of blood pouring over the horizon, engulfing the warren. Through the epigraph of the first chapter, Adams draws a deliberate parallel between Fiver and the mythical figure of Cassandra. But unlike the Greek prophetess, who is cursed to be ignored and disbelieved by those she warns, Fiver's vision is taken seriously by his brother. Returning to their warren, the 2 attempt to persuade their chief to evacuate, only for their concerns to be derided and dismissed. In the Sandalford warren, we are given a glimpse of one form of rabbit society, a stratified, vaguely aristocratic system presided over by a chief, who in turn is served by an owsla comprised of strong or clever rabbits. As Adams describes in a footnote, owslas vary. In one warren, the owsla may be the band of a warlord. In another, it may largely consist of clever patrollers or garden raiders. Sometimes a good storyteller may find a place, or a seer or intuitive rabbit. In the Sandalford warren at this time, the owsla was rather military in character, though, as will be seen later, not so military as some. Hazel and Fiver managed to persuade a number of fellow outskirters of similarly low social standing and prospects, as well as 2 dissatisfied members of the owsla, to flee their doomed home come nightfall, in a parallel to Aeneas's escape from Troy. The members of Hazel's band embody certain archetypes commonly found in heroic epics. Hazel is the underdog who must learn how to lead when command is thrust upon him. His brother Fiver, the mystically inclined seer, whose cryptic prophecies help to motivate and guide the group. Bigwig, a gruff, belligerent former owsla member, serves as the group's primary warrior, always eager for action, with Blackberry as clever thinker, Dandelion as storyteller, Bluebell as jokester, and Holly as the weary member of the Old Guard, having served as captain of the Sandalford owsla. Together, Adams' rabbits act with a determination and efficiency approaching that of a military platoon, which follows, given that several of Watership Down's characters were based on soldiers that the author had served alongside in the Second World War. As Adams himself wrote in his memoir years later, when recalling the officers and enlisted men in the 250th Light Company parachutists with whom he served, they comprised a very strong team, much stronger than any I had yet come across. Apart from that, collectively they have importance to this book, since later, from my memory, they provided the idea for Hazel and his rabbits in Watership Down. Certainly, the idea of the wandering, endangered and interdependent band, individually different yet mutually reliant, came from my experience of the company. But out of all of us, I think, there were only 2 direct parallels. Hazel, Watership Down's primary protagonist, was directly based on Adams' own commanding officer, Major John Gibbons, a leader Adams describes as unassuming and yet extremely competent, skilled at enabling others to see what it was he thought needed to be done, rather than simply barking orders. Bigwig, the rough, straightforward brawler, was inspired by Sergeant Paddy Kavanagh, who would give his life holding off approaching enemy forces while his comrades retreated to safety. Additionally, the character of Kihar, the coarse, Scandinavian-accented, black-headed gull, was inspired by a Norwegian resistance fighter Adams became acquainted with in the course of his service. As the rabbits journey across what to their eyes is uncharted, savage wilderness, Adams' prose does an excellent job at evoking the sense of dread and danger that is common to their kind. From the moment he entered it, the wood seemed full of noises. There was a smell of damp leaves and moss, and everywhere the splash of water went whispering about. Just inside, the brook made a little fall into a pool, and the sound, enclosed among the trees, echoed as though in a cave, Roosting birds rustled overhead. The night breeze stirred the leaves. Here and there a dead twig fell. And there were more sinister, unidentified sounds from further away, sounds of movement. To rabbits, everything unknown is dangerous. The first reaction is to startle, the second to bolt. Again and again they startled, until they were close to exhaustion. But what did these sounds mean, and where, in this wilderness, could they bolt to? But it is only upon finding more of their kind that the group, and Adams as an author, truly delve into an examination of a culture fully aware of the fragile state of its own existence, and how they might attempt to come to terms with it. The group soon encounter another warren, seemingly run by a rabbit named Cowslip. But while the others of Hazel's band are eager for a place to rest and recuperate, Fiver senses something off about their hosts. While his companions initially dismiss his concerns, they too gradually begin to notice strange things about Cowslip and his warren. The rabbits who dwell within it are large and healthy looking, but lack any sense of fitness for life in the wild, carrying themselves in an oddly graceful manner. And their warren's main entrance is extremely conspicuous, something that rabbits nearly universally avoid to hide their homes from predators. While being welcomed into the new warren, Hazel's companions find that its inhabitants engage in a number of peculiar, uncanny customs, including dance-like greetings, singing to their kits, which ordinary rabbits find distinctly unnatural, and even the creation of crude artwork on the walls that the newcomers fail to comprehend. The rabbits acknowledge no chief, and have no Owsla to maintain order. All are apparently equal. When Hazel asks the youngest member of his group, Pipkin, about his thoughts, he replies, "They're very nice and kind, but I'll tell you how they strike me. They all seem terribly sad. I can't think why, when they're so big and strong and have this beautiful warren, but they put me in mind of trees in November." Whenever one of the newcomers asks where, their hosts instantly change the subject. But most strange of all is the response Dandelion, the Sandalford group's storyteller, receives upon sharing a story of El Herrera. After telling a tale of the rabbit prince stealing lettuce, viewed as a delicacy, from a rival group of animals, they find that Cowslip and his rabbits are not only unfamiliar with the specific tale, but find their guests' belief in and respect for El Herrera and his trickery to be amusing, if misplaced. "Well, we don't tell the old stories very much," said Cowslip. "Our stories and poems are mostly about our own lives here. El Herrera doesn't really mean much to us." One of Hazel's friends responds that El Herrera is a trickster, and rabbits will always need tricks, only to be challenged by another of the warren's inhabitants. "No," said a new voice from a further end of the hall, beyond Cowslip. "Rabbits need dignity and, above all, the will to accept our fate." It is here we are introduced to the poet Silverweed. His mere presence seems to terrify Fiver, who describes the poet as smelling like barley rained down and left to rot in the fields. Silverweed then delivers a grim, morbid poem, which I will read excerpts from. "The wind is blowing, blowing over the grass. Where are you going, wind? Far, far away. Over the hills, over the edge of the world. The stream is running, running over the gravel. Through the brook lime, the kingcups, the blue and gold of spring. Take me with you, stream, away in the starlight. In autumn the leaves come blowing, yellow and brown. They rustle in the ditches, they tug and hang on the hedge. Where are you going, leaves? Far, far away. Take me, leaves, oh take me on your dark journey. In the deep places of the earth and the rabbit. Frith lies in the evening sky, the clouds are red about him. Oh take me with you, dropping behind the woods, far away, to the heart of light, the silence." Silverweed's poem is a fatalistic, and arguably nihilistic, reflection on the acceptance and inevitability of death, even containing a subtle reference to T.S. Eliot's landmark modernist poem The Waste Land, itself a brutal castigation of the spiritual emptiness of modern society. As the rabbit seer describes a number of natural processes, the wind blowing, a stream flowing, and the leaves turning in autumn, he expresses a morbid desire to become one with them, to cease his struggles as a living being, and dissolve into the world from which his body was formed, to have his flesh once more return to the deep places of the earth, as the leaves decompose into soil. In the final stanza, he switches from this imagery of more mundane natural cycles and turns to Frith, the god of all creation, imploring his god to take me with you, far away, to the heart of light, the silence. Silverweed's stance, shared by his comrades, goes beyond mere acceptance of his species' place at the bottom of the food chain into full-on veneration of their inevitable end. In Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, the famed psychologist described life itself as an unnatural aberration between periods of non-existence before birth and after death, a notion that seems to undergird the very society of Cowslip's Warren. Per this worldview, death, or lack of existence, is the natural state of the world. It is life that is unnatural, burdening conscious beings with the demands of existence while leaving a longing for oneness, or the overwhelming sense of the totality of existence that is occasionally glimpsed in religious ecstasy. This is obviously a worldview that many find not only highly disturbing, but difficult to logically refute, and when confronted with it, Fiver, like many readers, is naturally horrified. There is a subtle implication that Silverweed, like Fiver, is both blessed and cursed with the powers of prophecy and second sight, able to perceive and pierce the veil that lies between the living and the dead. As the former finishes his poem, Fiver is stricken with a paralyzing dread. Fiver, as he listened, had shown a mixture of intense absorption and incredulous horror. At one and the same time, he seemed to accept every word and yet to be stricken by fear. Once he drew in his breath, as though startled to recognize his own half-known thoughts, and when the poem was ended, he seemed to be struggling to come to himself. Fiver then flees in a hysterical frenzy, and when his brother and bigwig, the defecting Ausla member turned Hazel's de facto second-in-command, attempt to force him to rejoin them underground, they discover the Warren's sinister secret. Cowslip's Warren, also known as the Warren of the Shining Wire, is part of a farm where its inhabitants are allowed to live in a semi-natural state in order to produce healthier, more flavorful meat. Nearby humans provide ample food to the rabbits while setting snares about the place, but the rabbits who dwell there have come to accept this risk. Abandoning their cultural history and turning their backs on their people's values and traditions of utilizing trickery and cunning to survive, they live lives of apparent ease and plenty while attempting to ignore the fact that they or any of their friends might disappear at any moment, luring in newcomers in the hopes that they might be spared in the meantime. This arrangement has drawn numerous parallels among critics, the most obvious of which is with the Odyssey, where Odysseus and his crew are tempted to remain on the Isle of the Lotus Eaters, free to enjoy frivolous pleasures while abandoning their true quest. Others compare the Warren of the Shining Wire to the Soviet Union and other communist states, where class distinctions were supposedly abolished, and people's ties to their history were erased in order to bring about a new utopia, only for such attempts to end in misery, starvation, and mass murder as a new ruling class emerged, where people lived in constant fear that they, their family or friends might disappear at any moment, whisked away by the secret police to be executed or pressed into slave labor in the Gulag. But parallels can be drawn to modern Western society as well, of a prosperous, sheltered culture of rationalism so developed that it has abandoned its religious traditions and accepted a nihilistic outlook on life, seeing the founding myths of its culture as nothing more than amusing peculiarities, morbidly reveling in death as the only means of coping with its inevitability. Adam's ambiguity, and refusal to draw more direct parallels, imbues the text with a broader accessibility that has likely gone a long way towards ensuring its continued popularity. As Hazel and his companions journey onward, eventually finding a home atop Watership Down in Hampshire, they learn that two other rabbits from Sandalford Warren, Holly and Bluebell, have managed to track them. Holly tells of how Fiver's vision of death and destruction came true when Sandalford Warren was destroyed and its inhabitants ruthlessly slaughtered to make room for a housing development. The horrific flashbacks where Holly recounts the use of poison gas, with rabbits suffocating and being crushed as they blindly attempted to flee down tunnels the humans had blocked, serve as both a condemnation of the callous selfishness of humanity's endless expansion, which parallels that of El Herrera and his rabbits in the Lapine creation myth, as well as a reminder of the helplessness of rabbits themselves in the world in which they live. While in the process of establishing their new home, the group realized that, As they have no does, or female rabbits, among them, their attempt at founding a new society will not survive their current generation. Hazel's approach is twofold. After learning of the existence of an overcrowded warren, Ephrafa, somewhere nearby, he dispatches an envoy to ask if any does would be permitted to leave, while he and several others plan a raid on the nearby farm in an attempt to free the domestic rabbits being held in hutches there. As they prepare, Fiver advises his brother that he is taking an unnecessary risk, not only with his own life, but with the lives of those who follow him as their new chief rabbit. Hazel, who has grown accustomed to relying on Fiver's visions to avoid danger, asks if he has had one about the farm. "I've no feelings about the farm one way or the other," said Fiver, "but that doesn't necessarily mean it's all right. The feelings come when they will. But there's something that frightens me about you yourself, Hazel. Just you, not any of the others. You're all alone, sharp and clear, like a dead branch against the sky." Hazel disregards this vague advice, determined to cement his relatively new status as leader, only to be shot by the farmers when attempting to free the captive hutch rabbits. As his three companions flee back to Watership Down, despondent, Fiver sees a fourth rabbit, bloodied and obscured by shadow, limping among them, who vanishes as he approaches. Later, when sleeping, he has a nightmare of a man attempting to erect a mocking memorial for Hazel, in the form of the signpost that first hinted at the destruction of their old warren. And upon being woken, he sets out with another companion to find and retrieve a grievously wounded but still living Hazel. In the meantime, as the rabbits of Watership Down mourn the apparent death of their leader, Holly and the others sent as an envoy to Ephrafa return with further grim news. As it turns out, the Warren of Ephrafa is a dystopian nightmare ruled by the tyrannical General Woundwort, whose primary goal is to keep the presence of his warren and its inhabitants hidden from humanity. As with the Warren of the Shining Wire, the behavior of Woundwort and the Ephrafins is centered around confronting death. But whereas Cowslip and his comrades lapsed into a complacent malaise in the face of mortality, Woundwort has organized his society into a brutal military dictatorship. Having personally witnessed the deaths of his entire family at the hands of humans, and being terrified of myxomatosis, a devastating, blindness-inducing fungal infection used by humans to eradicate large populations of invasive rabbits, Woundwort has chosen to confront death by attempting to assert absolute control over the world around him, to the maximum extent possible. And though his method of rule lacks overt racial supremacist elements, the Warren of Ephrafa clearly evokes the imagery of Nazi Germany and its fascist allies and puppet states. Woundwort and the officers who serve under him operate on strict social Darwinist principles, perfectly content to let danger weed out the weaker members of their society in order that the whole may endure. Through this antagonist, Adams more thoroughly explores the pathologies of totalitarianism, the fear and trauma that can drive ordinary people to become, or support, a figure like Woundwort, who offers stability and security in an often terrifying world. Where the rabbits of Cowslip's warren willingly place themselves at the mercy of mankind, abandoning both heritage and legacy in the pursuit of personal fulfillment, and only managing to prolong their stagnating society's survival by luring in newcomers to share their fate, the Ephrafins veer to the opposite extreme, doing their utmost to avoid humanity, trading nearly every modicum of freedom for security, and exerting as much control over the world and each other as they possibly can, never bothering to consider if a life lived in this manner is even worth the heavy toll. From a certain viewpoint, the successive warrens portrayed in the novel seem to chart the recent course of Europe's own turbulent political history. Sandalford as the post-feudal kingdom, stable and yet stifling to those not blessed by circumstances of birth. The Warren of the Shining Wire as a revolutionary state, casting off the constraints of tradition in pursuit of utopia, only to collapse into carnage. Ephrafa as the militant reaction, prizing brutal strength and the survival of the species above any concern for individual welfare. And lastly, Watership Down itself as the society based on liberty and consent of the governed, where all willing to abide by their creed are free to join. This line of interpretation appears to be supported in the fates of the respective systems. Sandalford is destroyed in catastrophe after refusing to accept any measure of change, the Warren of the Shining Wire left forgotten on the ash heap of history. Fascist Ephrafa strikes out with the intention of implementing its vision over all competitors through violent force, only to fail when faced with the individualistic resolve of the Free Down. Additionally, the ever-lingering threat of human-wrought annihilation captures Cold War-era fears of nuclear holocaust, while the fact that Woundwort's death is never confirmed after his army's defeat implies that tyranny can only truly be kept at bay through constant vigilance. In the novel's climax, it is the resourcefulness and individualistic nature of the rabbits of Watership Down that allow them to triumph, first by infiltrating Ephrafa, organizing a breakout and managing a clever escape, and later through devising a trick to break the siege of their home warren. However, the story doesn't end with the hero's victory over the Ephrafans. Instead, we flash forward several years in an epilogue, where an aged Hazel rests in his burrow. Waking to find a stranger beside him, he stares at the newcomer for a moment before noticing his ears shining with faint silver light, recognizing the Prince of Rabbits. El Herrera has come to escort Hazel's soul into the afterlife, and offers him a place amongst the honored ranks of his personal Ausla, an offer that Hazel quickly accepts. The two slip out past the guards and emerge above ground, finding a few of Hazel's community grazing in the blustery, early morning chill. Here Hazel leaves his body lying in the grass, but turns back a moment for one final look at his home and its people. "You needn't worry about them," El Herrera tells him. "They'll be all right, and thousands like them. If you come along, I'll show you what I mean." Richard Adams concludes his novel with this final line, "And together they slipped away, running easily down through the wood, where the first primroses were beginning to bloom." Just as Watership Down began with the imagery of primrose flowers losing their petals, Hazel's story comes to a close as these same flowers are beginning to bloom once more, tying into the classical worldview of history occurring in cycles. In concluding Hazel's story in this manner, Adams calls back to the promise made by Frith to El Herrera in the Lapine creation myth. And El Herrera knew that although he would not be mocked, yet Frith was his friend. And every evening, when Frith has done his day's work and lies calm and easy in the red sky, El Herrera and his children and his children's children come out of their holes and feed and play in his sight, for they are his friends, and he has promised them that they will never be destroyed. The heroes have triumphed over the villains and secured a homeland, and all is right with the natural order. And while Hazel, like all living beings, must inevitably die, his legacy is carried on through his descendants, imbuing him with a sense of immortality, a way of transcending death. Frith promises not that any one individual shall live forever, but that their people will never be destroyed. This method of transcending death may seem antiquated to some, particularly to those averse to religious belief, but for the devout Orthodox Christian Adams, and indeed to vast swaths of humanity for the majority of our species' recent history, the ending of Watership Down espouses the primary goal of existence: to, as is written in the opening lines of the Book of Genesis, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. In touching on these fundamental aspects of not only cultural epics, but our existence as mortal creatures, it is easy to look back now and imagine Watership Down's success as a given. But this was hardly the case when the story was first envisioned. Though Richard Adams had long had a passion for storytelling, he had not seriously considered a career as a published author until his daughters, having loved the earliest incarnations of Watership Down that he began telling to them on long car rides, eventually persuaded their father to write the tale down. Then a civil servant, Adams set to work writing in his free time in 1966, spending 2 years finishing the novel, though it would be another 4 years until Watership Down saw publication. After being rejected by 7 different publishing houses and literary agents, he secured a deal with the niche, obscure London-based publisher Rex Collings, a deal which proved extremely fruitful for both, and catapulted Adams to literary stardom and international fame. For despite it being Richard Adams' debut work, Watership Down is one of the best-selling novels of all time, having sold more than 50 million copies as of the start of the 2020s. With its combination of naturalist realism and cultural anthropomorphizing, as well as its subtle use of fantasy elements, Watership Down breathed new life into the world of Xenofiction, ushering in a wave of works featuring animal societies with complex cultures, social structures, and myths, to the point where Adams' influence on Xenofiction could be said to rival Tolkien's impact on the broader genre of fantasy. Indeed, the influence of Watership Down on naturalist animal Xenofiction has been so monumental as to be almost impossible to overstate. The title itself has effectively become a byword for the subgenre it birthed, and nearly all animal stories written after its publication continue to dwell in its long shadow. Adams' debut sparked a veritable renaissance of animal literature, beginning in 1980 with the publication of William Horwood's Duncton Wood, told from the perspective of moles rather than rabbits. Horwood and his fellow Englishmen Gary Kilworth and David Clement Davies would become some of the most prominent authors to follow in the mythic tradition begun by Adams. Stories blending naturalism and cultural anthropomorphizing have since featured species as diverse as foxes, wolves, eagles, corvids, deer, bears, cats, badgers, owls, squirrels, bats, elephants, and more. As would be expected, these successors of Watership Down vary wildly in both quality and inventiveness. Clement Davies' 1999 debut Firebringer, praised by Adams himself, sticks quite closely to the story beats of its predecessor and somewhat suffers for it, while Brian Carter's magnificent 1981 novel A Black Fox Running, one of the earliest works to invoke Watership Down's legacy, launches in a radically new direction. Kilworth's 1989 book Hunter's Moon, quite strong in its own right, treads a comfortable middle ground. Horwood's Duncton Wood garnered enough success to spawn 5 sequels, and led the author to explore stories with other species, including wolves and eagles. With the novel's immense success and popularity has come numerous adaptations across various media, including radio dramas, stage plays, and 3 animated screen incarnations, a film, TV show, and miniseries. And while all 3 of the latter adaptations have their respective strengths and weaknesses, in my view, the definitive adaptation of Watership Down is the 1978 animated film by Martin Rosen's Nepenthe Productions. Though some changes will always be necessary when adapting a story from book to film, the 1978 animated feature manages to capture the heart of Adams' story, not only in its relatively faithful translation of the major plot points from page to screen, but also in how the animation, background designs, camera work, voice acting, score, and other technical aspects come together to give audiences a rabbit's eye view of the world in which they live. The first major change is that the Lapine creation story, where El Herrera and his rabbits are punished for their arrogance and become the prey of their myriad neighbors, is placed front and center as the opening scene. Animated in a vastly different style from the rest of the movie, this story is presented with artwork inspired by that of Aboriginal Australian culture, giving it a mythic, dreamlike aesthetic that helps to ground the culture of the rabbits in the story. Just before the film transitions to the primary narrative, with its realistic watercolors of the rural English landscape, the audience is given Frith's promise: "Be cunning and full of tricks, and your people will never be destroyed." The animators and background artists took care to portray the rest of the story in as realistic and lifelike a manner as possible, setting their adaptation against a backdrop of rustling leaves and waving fields of grass, of trickling streams where sunlight glints off the water's surface, while birds can be glimpsed flying overhead. The film's dynamic camera work serves to complement this detail. Shots consistently move against multi-layered backdrops, giving a sense of depth and energy, of a vibrant world teeming with life, and therefore fraught with danger for prey.
There's something unnatural and evil and twisted about this place.
The character designers did an excellent job at depicting all of the cast as realistic-looking rabbits while making them visually distinctive. Anyone familiar with the narrative can tell the 8 members of Hazel's band apart at a glance, and the voice acting, as with so much else, helps greatly to bring Adams' beloved story to life.
Tell you the truth, I'm getting sick and tired of it. Sometimes I feel like clearing out of the Warren altogether.
Watership Down secured a star-studded cast of talented British film and stage actors, including Sir John Hurt, whose subdued, slightly gravelly voice fits excellently with the aspiring leader Hazel, Richard Breers, Michael Graham Cox, John Bennett, Ralph Richardson, Hannah Gordon, Harry Andrews, and Sir Nigel Hawthorne. Unlike as was common in many animated films at the time, and even still to this day, each of the voice actors gives a tempered, grounded delivery that aids the narrative illusion that the audience is indeed watching a group of rabbits trying to survive in the wild.
Hazel, we'll have to stop here. Fiver and that other half-size one are all in. They need to rest.
He's right, Hazel.
I think we should get back to the burrow.
Back to the burrow? It'll come there. Don't think it won't. It's all around us.
We should have to cross it. Cross it? Who's going to cross it? What do you want to cross it for?
Character animators often worked closely with the voice actors, helping to fit the individual's movements to the tones and cadence of their voices, an effect which can be seen in the nervous, anxious stances, movements, and glances made by the characters in the film. All of these other aspects are complemented by Angela Morley's beautiful film score, encapsulating the spirit of pastoral England with soft, somber, melancholic, and reflective pieces utilizing flutes, harps, and violins, while French horns sound in moments of triumph. Ultimately, what this film is best remembered for is its depictions of violence. And here, not only is the public perception of the animated adaptation exaggerated, but in many ways it misses the point. Both the novel and film contain depictions of violence and death, but, as is often the case with animal stories, Watership Down was inaccurately and unfairly stuck with the often dismissively used label of children's literature. As a result, many younger children were exposed to the film by parents or guardians who were uninformed about the nature of the story. And while it is one thing to read about violence, leaving something to the imagination, it is another to have it presented in graphic visual detail. That being said, Watership Down's violence is neither gratuitous nor excessive. In fact, there are only a handful of instances where blood or gore is even shown, and all of these serve to reinforce the fragile nature of life for our protagonist's species. Ironically, the darkest aspect of the film lies not in its depictions of graphic violence, but in its faithful adaptation of the novel's exploration of mortality, which can perhaps best be encapsulated in the final scene. After the defeat of General Woundwort and his Ephraim army, the shot lingers on the sun, obscured by clouds, as we transition to an indeterminate amount of years later. Fog lingers over the downs as leaves fall from the trees, heralding the arrival of autumn, a season often used to symbolize old age, a period of decay between the prime of summer and the world's metaphorical death in winter. Likewise, the gray fog enveloping the rabbit's home can be viewed as death's calm embrace slowly closing in on the hero of our story. Hazel feeds in the foreground while his descendants, and those of his original companions, can be seen gathered in the background, as a mother rabbit tells the newer generation the story of the world's creation.
And his children and his children's children come out of their holes and feed and play in his sight.
In doing so, we are reminded once more of Frith's promise, that the descendants of Elahera will be free to emerge from their homes to feed and play, for while each of them will, as individuals, inevitably die, their people as a whole will live on. Here, Hazel is confronted by the Black Rabbit. Unlike in the novel, where it is Elahera who asks Hazel to join him in the afterlife. In this way, the movie implies that Elahera and the Black Rabbit are possibly connected, two aspects of one greater whole. And Hazel, after a wistful glance at his descendants, is reassured that his people will be all right without him. Hazel then follows the Black Rabbit through the woods and up into the sun, while Frith's promise from the beginning of the film is repeated a final time.
Be cunning, and your people will never be destroyed.
Five years after his authorial debut, Richard Adams would return to Xenofiction, and to his exploration of mortality, with a spiritual successor to his rabbit-centered epic, 1977's The Plague Dogs. But unlike in Watership Down, with its modernist style and classical trappings, The Plague Dogs would see Adams venture into the realm of literary postmodernism, emphasizing authorial self-awareness and employing irony, subversion, and deconstruction in its deliverance of philosophical and social commentary. The Plague Dogs is an extremely dense and ambitious novel, even more so than Adams' epic debut. It is at once a survival adventure story, a diatribe against the inhumane animal experimentation that was conducted with relative commonality throughout much of the 20th century, and a philosophical confrontation with pessimistic nihilism, the idea that existence, being inherently infused with meaningless suffering, is an evil in and of itself. Its central story concerns the journey of two dogs, Ralph and Snitter, who escape from a laboratory after being subjected to unimaginably cruel experiments. In the aftermath of their escape, the scientists at the lab attempt to cover up their actions and responsibility, Local farmers organize hunts after their livestock began turning up dead, journalists sensationalize the story and spread panic in order to profit, and bureaucrats and politicians try to salvage the situation when attempting to protect their own careers. It is a testament to Adams' tremendous skill as an author that he managed to juggle all of these competing threads in a coherent manner, utilizing the myriad subplots to scathingly satirize self-serving politicians, exploitative media figures, and callous scientists. But the primary purpose of the novel goes far beyond these societal critiques. For at the heart of The Plague Dogs lies a question that has haunted human thinkers since the dawn of civilization. Why must the innocent suffer? And just as the use of rabbits in Watership Down served to add further subtext, so too does the species of the main characters in The Plague Dogs play an important function. In the role of protagonists, Adams casts a pair of dogs, creatures who have evolved alongside ourselves for tens of thousands of years, who have been closely integrated into our society, and with whom we have developed a degree of cross-species empathy not found anywhere else on the planet. As beings attuned to our social cues and yet incapable of committing immoral acts the way we ourselves are, dogs are often seen as an embodiment of innocence, and automatically evoke a degree of sympathy in many human beings, as our two species have quite literally evolved to elicit positive emotions from one another. And so, right from the opening, audiences are primed to feel horror and revulsion at the events we are thrust into the midst of, because unlike its mythic predecessor, which opened with idyllic, if melancholic, imagery of the pristine English countryside, The Plague Dogs begins in a grim, sterile laboratory, as detached scientists loom over a metal tank filled with sloshing water. As the two men emotionlessly remark on the procedure they are overseeing, the audience gradually learns that the pair are conducting an endurance experiment, by which a dog is placed into a tank of water and forced to swim until exhaustion overcomes it, at which point they allow it to drown. With this framing, Adams conjures archetypal imagery of birth, of the watery enclosure of the womb, while managing to distort it into a horrifying mockery of nature, with its metal walls and cold, sterile setting, as the dog desperately breaks the water's surface one final time before fatigue drags it back down. After an agonizing 2 hours and 23 minutes, the pair of scientists, Dr. Robert Boycott and his assistant Stephen Powell, watch as the dog plummets to the bottom of the tank, at which point they retrieve and resuscitate it, an ordeal the dog is forced to endure every other day, over and over and over again. It is only after this scene, where the barely conscious dog is brought back to its pen, that we are given a proper introduction to both it and its closest companion in the facility. The dog subjected to the drowning tank is Ralph, a black Labrador mix purchased for laboratory usage shortly after his birth, who has never known any other life outside the walls of the facility. Among his fellow captives is the occupant of the neighboring cage, a black and white fox terrier named Snitter. Ralph is physically strong on account of the endurance testing he is repeatedly subjected to, but his horrifying treatment has left him with a bitter hatred of humanity, even as his canine instincts compel him to believe that his suffering is just and proper, that dogs were meant to serve man, whatever that may entail. His introduction upon waking up back in his pen helps to convey the frantic, damaged state of his psyche. The black dog sprang to its feet, and as it did so, the flow of oxygen from the pipe cut out automatically. Teeth bared, eyes glaring, ears laid flat, it backed against its kennel, crouching into the straw and barking as though beset on every side. Snitter, on the other hand, was born in the outside world, and lived with a loving master for several years. One day, after escaping from his yard to follow the man, he ran out in front of a truck and was saved when his owner threw him out of the way, only for the man to be struck by the vehicle and seemingly killed. After being sold to the laboratory by the man's cruel sister, Snitter was subjected to a drastic brain operation designed to confuse the objective and subjective within his mind, allowing his emotions and memories to bleed into what his senses perceive from the outside world, and giving him a bizarre, surreal manner of interpreting events, even as he remains aware to some degree that the whitecoats, the dog's term for laboratory personnel, have somehow induced madness in him. Despite longing for the happiness of his past life, Snitter feels terrible guilt over his role in his master's apparent death, a guilt that now, thanks to the experimentation performed on him, manifests itself in his perception of the world, leading to him quite literally reliving the most traumatic experience of his life on a regular basis. He often makes references to the lorry coming or getting across the black and white road when confused or frightened. But in spite of all this, he still hasn't lost hope that good humans remain, and that he and his friend will one day get free of the Whitecoat's clutches. After an assistant leaves the door to Ralph's cage partially unhinged, Snitter is able to dig underneath the wire between their two pens and join his friend, where he attempts to both explain that the two can escape and rouse Ralph to make the effort to do so. As he often does over the course of the novel, Snitter recalls the happiness and security he enjoyed when in the care of his owner, who he refers to as a master, in contrast to the Whitecoats who now preside over the dogs' lives. Ralph growled, "You're always talking about a master. I never had a master, but I know what a dog's business is as well as you do."
"Ralph, listen. We must get across the road. Get across the road before—"
"A dog stands firm," Ralph said sharply. "A dog never refuses whatever a man requires of him. That's what a dog's for. So if they say go in the water, I'll..." He broke off, cowering. "I tell you, I can't stand that water anymore. Dogs are meant to do what men want. I can smell that, without a master. The men must have some reason, mustn't they? It must do some sort of good. They must know what's best."
"It's a nuisance, but you can't bury bones here," said Snitter. "I've tried. The ground's too hard. My head still aches. No wonder. There's a garden in my ear, you know. I can hear the leaves rustling quite clearly."
"Only I can't bear the water again," said Ralph. "And you can't fight it, not the water." He began pacing up and down the wire. In their conversation, Ralph bounces back and forth between swearing defiance against the Whitecoats and meekly submitting to any future tortures, writing off the idea of escape as not only impossible but immoral, an abandonment of his very duties as a dog in service to mankind. And in his view, even if they do somehow manage to escape, they will find no better world to greet them, a mindset which can be summed up in the line he repeatedly states as a sort of mantra: "It's a bad world for animals." Eventually, however, Snitter is able to break through the miasma clouding his mind for a moment, and remember why he snuck into Ralph's pen.
"The wire swing,"
said Snitter, sitting up suddenly.
"The door, Ralph. That's why I came. The door of your pen's unfastened. We can go through it, Ralph."
"What for?"
"Ralph, we might be able to get out of here."
"They'd only bring us back. Dogs are supposed to do what men want. I've never had a master, but I know that."
"The suffering, Ralph. The misery you've endured."
"As dogs were born to suffering. It's a bad world for animals."
"Ralph, you owe them nothing. Nothing. They're not masters."
"Canine nature. The whole duty of dog."
"Ralph, the water. What could be worse than the metal water? Hours and hours of struggling in the metal water, Ralph. And in the end, they'll let you drown. Think of the Whitecoats, Ralph. What you told me, peering down into the tank and watching you. They aren't masters. Believe me. I've had a master. I know. If we could only get out of here, we might find a master. Who can tell? A proper pack leader. Isn't it worth a try?"
This bit of dialogue, which occurs after the two accidentally smash a rat cage during their escape, provides an excellent example of Snitter's bizarre, poetic way of viewing and describing the world. Ralph was still sniffing about the glassy floor when Snitter once more interrupted him.
"Leave it spilt, old Ralph. Let it trickle away.
It's made the floor sharp and the blood will run out of your nose." After traversing the laboratory and sneaking out through a vent in the incinerator, the two find themselves in the rugged lake district of rural, northwestern England, a land of rocky fells and foggy, low-lying moors. As the two traverse this unfamiliar landscape, Snitter is especially confused, not recognizing anything of the domesticated world he was taken from. Attempting to rationalize the changes, he explains to Ralph that the Whitecoats must have taken all the houses away as some sort of experiment or exercise of power, though he remains hopeful that the two will eventually be able to find masters, reinforcing the dichotomous view of humanity, the just, caring masters and the cruel, callous Whitecoats. Ralph, however, remains doubtful, arguing that even if good humans did once exist, they must be gone by now. As the two wander for some time, all the while growing hungrier, Ralph begins to entertain the idea of returning, still grappling with guilt over his supposed betrayal of the scientists at the lab. Snitter fervently maintains that they were not masters, that Ralph owed them nothing, and that his friend will understand once they found a true master of dogs.
"We've got to find some men," resumed Snitter at length.
Why?
Dogs have to have men. We need masters. Food, shelter. Come on. We can't stay here. The whitecoats will be looking for us.
Do you think they've really gone then? Asked Ralph. I mean, suppose there aren't any men left, anywhere. If there was none at all.
There will be. What I can't understand is why they've changed everything.
Having his characters thrust into an unfamiliar landscape, where nearly every inhabitant ends up being set against them, Adams' narrative takes on elements of post-apocalyptic literature, an approach accentuated by his vivid descriptions of the bleak environment the two dogs find themselves traversing. It was a scene of squalid desolation, of ragged spoil heaps and other debris of abandoned industry. In all directions across the disfigured landscape, channels, raw and man-made, ran like mill races, streaming down steep slopes or cutting unnaturally over patches of encroaching fell. This sense of alienation is furthered by the author's use of the distinctive Geordie dialect, a variant of the English language spoken by the inhabitants of rural northern England, full of unique pronunciation and terminology derived from Scandinavian and Germanic languages, which Adams employs not only in the speech of human locals, but of animals native to the region as well. When Ralph and Snitter come across a pair of sheepdogs aiding their master in rounding up his flock, the two escapees attempt to join in order to secure a place at the shepherd's side, only to end up scattering the sheep and angering the local dogs.
Hey, what thou dost think thou'rt playing at? Art stark bloody mad or what?
Snitter looked up. Just above him, on a peat bank, one of the black and white sheepdogs was standing, glaring down with an expression of mingled bewilderment and blazing fury. It smelt as angry as any dog Snitter had ever encountered in his life. Frightened and confused, he said,
"It's all right. We don't mean you any harm. You see, we need a master. We're straying. We were just joining in."
Ralph was beside him now, silent and waiting.
"Art out of thy minds, chasing yows up and down fell, snapping and biting? Where's thy farm at? Where's thy master? Thou's nipped yon yow, the bastard. It's bleeding yon."
The sheepdog became inarticulate with rage and incomprehension. After being driven off by the dogs, and the threat of their master returning with a gun, Ralph and Snitter are forced to confront the idea that they may have to provide for themselves, which leaves them with only one clear path: to become wild animals, to live by their teeth and kill to survive. Thus begins the pair's long war against humanity, as they take to preying on the sheep that roam the fells to sustain themselves. With Snitter's small stature and fractured mental state, he is forced to rely on Ralph to make the kills for him. But Ralph, who has gone from a life of unimaginable suffering in the laboratory to a miserable, desperate existence as a predator, lacks the spirit to endure without his friends' reassurances that they will either find a master or thrive as wild animals. In this way, the two complement each other in a profoundly touching and believable manner, each knowing that no matter what the pair may be forced to endure, they will not have to endure it alone. Ralph made no answer for a long time. At last, he said, "I believe. I'm almost afraid to believe, but yes, I do believe you're right, Snitter. And if you are..."
"Yes?"
"It'll prove that we were right to escape after all. And we'll have a chance to prove, to ourselves anyway, that dogs can live without men. We'll be wild animals, and we'll be free." Snitter knows enough to ignore the traumatized Ralph's frequent outbursts of rage, while Ralph, despite often being frustrated with Snitter's impaired faculties, and even having his life endangered by them on occasion, never fails to provide for his vulnerable friend. Both broken seemingly beyond hope in very different ways, the optimistic Snitter and pessimistic Ralph support each other as best they can, desperately clinging to one another to survive the ravages of a world that seems to want nothing more than to see the two of them suffer and die. When Snitter woke in the near darkness of the shaft, it was to the accustomed sense of loss and madness, to the dull ache in his head, the clammy sensation of the torn and sodden dressing above his eye, and the recollection that he and Ralph were masterless fugitives, free to keep themselves alive for as long as they could in an unnatural, unfamiliar place, of the nature of which they knew practically nothing. He did not even know the way back to animal research, or whether, if they did return, they would be taken in. He started up from where he was lying on the dry shale.
Ralph, listen. You will kill me, won't you? You could do it quite quickly. It wouldn't be difficult. Ralph?
While Ralph, who has never known human kindness, wavers in his commitment to living wild and often contemplates returning, Snitter urges him to shed his sense of loyalty to man, even going so far as to ask his friend to kill him rather than let him be recaptured. But, as it turns out, the two do not have to face the world entirely alone, for after bringing down a sheep and retiring to the abandoned mineshaft they have made their home, the pair find that another creature has joined them in the darkness. The next instant he jumped back with a sharp yap of astonishment, for the voice answering him was speaking, unmistakably, a very odd sort, of dog language. Barely understandable, and like nothing he had ever heard, the voice, nevertheless, was undoubtedly that of an animal in some way akin to themselves. "Who are you, kidda?" replied the animal, in the same strange dog jargon. "Nae need for you and me to start battling. La la let, my bonny pet." Listening, Snitter felt his blood tingle, not with fear but with a kind of thrilled repulsion and attraction. The voice of the smell was obsequious, cunning, that of a thief, a liar, masterless, callous, and untrustworthy. It was also full of sardonic humor, of courage and resource, and pitiless, most of all for itself. Its lilting rogue's jargon spoke to its own madness. Fascinated, he waited to hear it speak again. The two find that they have been tracked by a fox, who has cautiously observed their blunderings since their escape several days prior. Like the other inhabitants of the lakeland portrayed in the novel, this creature speaks in a thick Geordie dialect, specifically the Upper Tyneside variant, a rural and even more distinctive version that Adam's transliterations bring to life, emphasizing how alien the fox's thought and behavior are to the two dogs. "I mean to live here as a wild animal, that's the long and short of it," said Ralph. "Snitter can go and look for men if he wants to. I'm a mouse and this is my drain." "Without me, bonny lad, I'll give you nae more than 3 morns." "Go on," said Snitter. "Why not?" "I've seen naught after the pair on yous, lying flat out on the fell like wee piggies full of grub, like there was neither dergs nor shepherd about. Ye fellas the yow, bolts it doon ye, keeps ye doon a spell and comes back like a pair of squalling cubs. Ye took nae heed at all of shepherds gun or dergs. I'd think shame of ye pair of daft nuts." Ralph's hackles rose at the sardonic mockery in the sharp, thin voice, and at once its tone changed to one of open, honest admiration. "Bye, mind, ye pulled yon yow doon clever though. Bye, hinny, you're a hard un. There's none like ye. Hard as the hobs ye are. A fair mazer." This fox is simply known as the Todd, an older term for a male of his species, a nameless, opportunistic vagabond who senses a chance at easy living in the strength of Ralph, who is capable of bringing down full-grown sheep. Ralph immediately distrusts the Todd, suspecting that it is only using them for personal gain, but Snitter is intrigued by its primal nature and unabashed confidence in its own abilities, and presses his friend to accept the creature's offer to teach them how to survive in the wild. With his bizarre way of viewing the world, Snitter seems to have less trouble understanding the Todd's dialect, even going so far as to adopt some of its mannerisms, including terms like reet mazer, a skilled friend, and hadaway hiem, meaning return home. Ralph, on the other hand, struggles to understand much of what their new wild partner says, and grows increasingly frustrated both with its mocking of their clumsiness and with their dependence on it in order to survive. Nonetheless, its tutelage proves instrumental, for the Todd quickly teaches them to kill far from where they are dwelling, to never leave their kills out in the open, and to never kill twice in the same spot back to back. Over the course of the novel, tensions between Ralph and the Todd periodically flare, leading to several instances where the fox abandons the pair, only to later return. This three-way dynamic between the two escapees and their on-again, off-again wild partner forms the core of the remaining story. Throughout their travels, even as Snitter embraces his newfound status as a wild animal, he remains convinced that good humans still exist, and retains a shred of hope that the pair may eventually be taken in by them. Ralph, on the other hand, grows increasingly feral and consumed by rage as the two struggle to adapt to the brutality of life in the wild. Adams frequently references this state with the repeated motif, often heard in the hallucinations that Snitter suffers, as lost dog seeking vanished man. Conditioned through birth and evolution to believe his purpose lies in serving humanity, Ralph struggles with the concept of facing them as adversaries, continuing to feel both guilt and shame at supposedly having failed to do his duty as a dog. The Todd has little patience for such sentimentality, and tries, over the course of the story, to hammer home that after killing sheep, he is no longer a dog at all in the eyes of man, but rather a wild beast fit only to be shot. I'm going to find the Whitecoats and give myself up. Don't try to stop me, Snitter.
It's you that's crazy, Ralph, not me. Whatever for?
Because I've come to see that all I've done is run away from my duty. That's why. Dogs were meant to serve men. Do you think I don't know? I knew all the time, but I was too much of a coward to admit it. I should never have listened to you, Snitter. If they need me to drown for them...
Of course dogs were meant for men, Ralph, but not for that. Not for the tank and the Whitecoats.
Who are we to judge? How do we know? I'm a good dog. I'm not the brute they all thought I was. The men know best.
Yes, masters, Ralph, but not Whitecoats. They don't care what sort of dog you are. You're nae a dirg new, you're a sheep killer, whispered the Todd. They'll blow your arse out, hinny. Howay, let's be off, or you'll both be deed and done inside half an hour, nee bother.
What end can there be to this? Said Ralph to Snitter. To run about loose until they find us. How long?
You said we'd become wild animals. That's what they do. Live till they die. Aye, run on till the dark comes down. Are we going new, or did I go mysel? I warned you'd best be sharp.
The Todd references death as the dark, rendered as a proper noun, a state he only vaguely understands as the endpoint of every creature's life. While the Todd does not fear the dark per se, he does all he can to keep ahead of it, even at the expense of his own companions. Snitter is quick to understand this mindset, and gradually begins adopting it himself, even coming to accept that he, as the weakest member of the trio, would likely be the first to be left behind. When Ralph tells his friend, regarding the Todd, I only trust him just as long as he goes on feeling I can fill his belly, and bitingly asks what would happen if his own leg was caught in a wire, Snitter nonchalantly responds, We're wild animals. What could he do for you then? Die with you? You tell him what sense there'd be in that. While The Plague Dogs is far more grounded in its depictions of animal behavior than Watership Down, it still does share certain mythic elements with its predecessor, and like everything else about the dynamic between Ralph, Snitter, and their wild ally, these help to showcase the differing attitudes towards both life and death. While resting after a hunt, Ralph and Snitter reminisce about a deceased friend of theirs from the lab, the dog Kiff, who devised a mocking song to pass on to the other inmates before being killed by electrocution as part of an experiment. The song, with its upbeat tone and dark, sardonic lyrics, was intended as both an act of defiance against the Whitecoats and a dirge for those who sung it, describing a new arrival being gruesomely experimented on with a refrain of, We're all up for the chimney, referencing the incinerator used to dispose of their bodies. After the Todd joins in and the song concludes, the two dogs discuss their old companion in an oddly nostalgic way. Snitter says that if Kiff were there now, he'd ask what the group meant to do in the long run.
How long do you suppose we can keep it up? Running about in this empty, man-made place, killing fowls and animals and dodging guns? I mean, where's it going to end? Where's it going to get us?
Where it gets the Todd.
Aye, hinny. Let's be happy through the neat. But they're bound to get us in the end, Ralph. Ralph, we've got to find some sort of men. It's our only chance.
In an attempt to comfort his friend, Ralph then recounts a story he remembers his mother telling him as a puppy, one of the only memories he has of her, the tale of the Star Dog. In it, the all-powerful Star Dog creates and populates the world, appointing mankind to govern the Earth and its inhabitants. But over the course of a series of departures and returns, the Star Dog finds that upon each new visit, man has spoiled ever more of the world through development, pollution, overhunting, and blood sports, treating animals and nature not as charges under their care, but as property with which to do whatever they want. Before each departure, the Star Dog warns humanity to change their ways, and upon each return finds things even worse than before, until finally, it issues its punishment. While beasts will continue to live in the moment, mankind will have the foresight to see their inevitable deaths, and will be tempted to use their intelligence and skills to war with one another, to engage in murder, theft, and other injustices, to be forever alienated from the world in which they live. In the end, only two species choose to go with them, dogs and cats, who continue to vie for the affection of their cursed masters. The myth is essentially a corrupted retelling of the earliest chapters of Genesis from the Bible, with the star dog in the role of God and all of humanity in the place of Adam and Eve. But here the temptation comes from their own abilities, arising from within their own hearts. And unlike in the biblical story, where God, upon witnessing the world, declares creation as good, here the creator appears to abandon the world after such failure, with Ralph remarking, "I believe, myself, that the Stardog's given it all up as a bad job. He must have, for what good are men to animals?" A little while later, the two dogs press the Todd as to whether his own kind has any stories or songs, and after a moment, he shares one of the latter that his mother sang to him in the den. The rustic ballad describes a fox using his wiles to steal livestock from a baffled farmer and his wife, serving as both a celebration of their kind's trickster status and a reminder to other foxes to always be quick and clever. But the gleeful nature of the song stands in stark contrast to the question Snitter asks after the final stanza. "There's mist o' the tops to hide ye, there's bracken thick o' the fell, streams where the hounds won't track ye, ye've lugs me Todd and smell. There's shiny neats, you'll lope and lark, and randy run to the vixen's bark, ca canny yelts, you're further dark, yon fettles all you're jumpin'." "What became of your mother, Todd?" Snitter asked. "Hoons," replied the Todd indifferently, and began licking one paw. Even when recalling the death of his own mother, the Todd shows no sentimentality or grief. This is simply the life he was born to, where the dark, or death, may claim a wild creature at any moment for even the slightest mistake. Knowing that he will eventually be for the dark, in his parlance, the Todd sees no point in dwelling on death beyond escaping from it in the presence of immediate danger. As the dogs begin to fell more and more sheep under the tutelage of the Todd, a number of local farmers organize a hunt with the assistance of a tailor, Mr. Ephraim, who hopes to use the situation to both provide a service to his community and introduce his products to more potential customers. When the others involved in the hunt go off to search a rugged area in which the dogs are believed to be hiding, Mr. Ephraim waits by the road with the vehicles, being unaccustomed to more strenuous outings. Here, the author rather subtly reveals that the tailor is a Holocaust survivor. Mr. Ephraim noticed little and felt less of the lonely scene around him. As much as he could, he avoided being alone, for all too often the memories induced by solitude would speak with the voices of hell. At the end of this paragraph, where he recalls in vague detail the forced disappearances of relatives, desperate flight of his family, and later confinement at Auschwitz, he concludes with the line, "It's a bad world for the helpless," echoing Ralph's sentiments about the world being a bad place for animals. It is with this shared understanding of the suffering of innocence in mind that Mr. Ephraim spots Snitter approaching through the brush alone. At first, the man reaches for his gun and releases the safety, forgetting his past trauma in the excitement of being the one to bring the hunt to an end. But he soon spots the surgical gash along Snitter's skull, which immediately brings to mind his own horrific experiences at the hands of Nazi medical officials. Setting his gun aside, he calls to Snitter, who, initially hesitant, quickly warms to the first friendly human being he has encountered since his escape. As Snitter approaches, we switch once more to his perspective. The dog finds himself struggling through mist as another fit of madness grips him. And here, Adam suggests a supernatural element to his mental state, as he catches glimpses of Ephraim's past suffering through the whirlwind enveloping his mind. Frightened, he shrank trembling against the stone wall as the road before him filled with a river of inaudible sounds, noiseless indeed, yet clear as those unreal threads of light which in summer drought appear like trickling water across short grass on the hills. Children's voices he could hear, weeping and calling for help as they were swept away. Women's, clutching after them and crying in agony. Men's, trying to utter prayers and fragments of liturgies cut short as the flood engulfed them. Mockery, too, there was, and echoes of mean, cruel violence. And here, as Ephraim tries to aid Snitter while still absent-mindedly clutching the barrel of his shotgun, Snitter's paw catches on the trigger guard and causes it to discharge, killing the man, and reinforcing the traumatized dog's belief that he is cursed to doom any man who shows him kindness. In the aftermath of this incident, Ralph sets out to find his friend, while the Todd refuses to help. Eventually, the former manages to track Snitter down, giving readers great insight into their friendship. Ralph is initially angry with Snitter for wandering off on his own, and frustrated by his confused state of mind, while Snitter seems aware, to some degree, that in killing a man, he has doomed them both. As Snitter's fractured mind wavers on the brink of shattering entirely, his friend attempts to console him. After a long time, Ralph asked, "Is that why you've so often told me you're falling?" Snitter made no reply, and he went on, "It's a bad world for animals. You might just as well have fallen. Out of the sky, I mean. There's no going back there, where you've come from, is there? Never. But at least it's over, Snitter. It can't happen again."
"It can. It does," whispered Snitter. "That's the dreadful thing. Men can do worse things than hurt or starve you. I'm not going outside again. Not anymore. If I can die and stop it all, then I'll stay here and do that. But perhaps I've died already. Perhaps even dying doesn't stop it."
"The Todd's left us," said Ralph. "He wouldn't come with me to look for you."
"Do you blame him?"
"It's his nature, I suppose. We'll just have to do the best we can without him. Some of what you've said may be true for all I know. I can't understand it, really. There's no way out for us, I'm sure of that. But at least I mean to stay alive as long as I can, like the Todd. And as for dying, I'll fight before I'm killed." As the hunt for the dogs ramps up and drags ever more people into the fray, including journalists, bureaucrats, and politicians, the Todd rejoins the two, aiding the fugitives in their increasingly desperate flight from man. And as he does so, continuing to instruct them even as they frequently disregard his advice and inadvertently endanger him, we get hints that there may be more to his character than the self-serving rogue he makes himself out to be. When Ralph asks why the opportunistic fox bothers to aid them when their situation appears so dire, he responds, "They'll be hunting noo till they find the pair of yous. Need do about that. If I had the sense I was born with, I'd be off and away myself and leave you to it." "That'd be the end of us, Todd. Without you, we'd have been finished a long while back."
"Aye, need do about that neither. Way," the Todd paused. "Way, I'll not be taking myself off yet. But mind, I'm telling you, gone where I tell you to, and nee mucking about, or I'm away like a shot and you can fend for yourselves."
"If you think we're as badly off as that, why are you staying on with us?"
"Maybe's I'm sorry for that wee fella." The Todd paused. "Maybe's."
"I don't believe that, you smelly..." Ralph broke off, choking and coughing, and again clawed at his muzzle. Up here, on the higher ground, the mist was so thick that they could scarcely see one another.
"I warn't ye divn't, nee kiddin'."
"Why don't you talk straight for once?" Ralph, infuriated by his enforced dependence on the Todd to guide him through the mist, growled dangerously, and at once the Todd became obsequious.
"Give over, hinny. Divn't gan on say. Talk straight. All reet then. You'll never leave your mother, nor will ya? And you're the one that fells the owls, reet?"
While he claims to only help the two because of Ralph's ability to kill sheep, and the fact that Ralph himself will never abandon Snitter, by any calculated metric, this benefit would not outweigh the risk. It is thus all the more tragic that Ralph, for all his horrible experiences of the world, cannot bring himself to trust anyone else besides Snitter, and even Snitter cannot be relied upon for anything beyond moral support. His companions in desperation, he thought, the one whose very talk he could barely understand, more crafty and self-interested than any cat, whom he now knew he hated for its sly, calculating cunning, who would desert them both without the least compunction whenever it might decide that it would suit it to do so. The other his friend, the only creature in the world who cared a fly for him, but who seemed to grow more addle-pated and more of a liability with every precarious day they survived. It was for these that he had to go on, night after night, mustering his diminishing strength for yet another plunging, battering encounter, using up what little was left of his courage and endurance, until the time when there would be none left, whereupon the Todd would depart and Snitter and himself would either starve or be cornered and killed. No, he thought, the Todd had been right enough. He was no wild animal. Nor, after all, had it proved possible for him to become one. Though he might never have had a master, yet by his nature he needed the friendship of other creatures as the Todd did not. Eventually, the tensions between Ralph and the Todd come to a head when, After the trio goes for several days without food, the fox devours a clutch of eggs near a farm while leaving nothing for his companions. Ralph angrily drives their partner off, swearing that he will kill the fox the next chance he gets, while Snitter laments his friend's impulsive decision. As the days pass and snow begins to fall, the dog's fortunes dwindle even further, until Ralph begins to regret driving away the Todd, recognizing how it may very well have doomed them. In his growing frustration at their fate, he becomes quicker to snap at his companion. Snitter flung his head up, howling in terror. "What's the matter now?" growled Ralph, startled out of sleep beside him. "Why on earth can't you keep quiet?"
"Oh, thank goodness! A dream! I'm sorry, Ralph. I suppose it's the hunger. It's more than 3 days now since we've eaten anything. Not a beetle, not a caterpillar."
"I know that as well as you do. Well then, 3 days, 4 days. Go to sleep. I deserve it even if you don't." Even so, he remains committed to keeping the pair alive, refusing to consider surrender when Snitter contemplates it. Then, with sudden determination,
"Ralph, I'm going to look for the Todd, and if I can't find him, I'm going down to some farm or other and give myself up to the men. Anything's better than starving to death."
Ralph, battered and hollow as an old kettle discarded among the stones, grinned up at him from his refuge of despair. "Your dignity. I hope we die alone."
"Oh, Ralph."
"Go on then, off you go. I'm damned if I'm going to be taken back to the Whitecoats' tank. I'd rather starve here. It'll be less trouble. And as for finding the Todd, I tell you, Snitter, if you can do that, I'll make some food drop down to us off the tops. There you are, that's a bargain. One's as likely as the other."
"Now the snow's gone, the men may have brought some sheep back up here. Couldn't we try to find one?"
Without replying, Ralph put his head back on his paws and shut his eyes. By this point, the two are on the verge of perishing from starvation and hypothermia. Snitter, deciding that a quick death would be preferable, sets out to turn himself in, only to hear distant hunting horns. As he looks on, he has a final encounter with the Todd, who races up out of the swirling fog. Up through the mist and wind came the Todd. Limping it was, its breath coming in great, steaming gasps, brush trailing, eyes staring, belly caked with mud. Its teeth were bared above and below its lolling tongue, and it turned its head this way and that, continually listening and sniffing the air. As Snitter tries to persuade it to hide with him and Ralph, the Todd refuses his offer, rather selflessly urging Snitter to flee so that he too is not killed. Having led the dogs on for more than 7 miles without managing to lose them, the Todd knows that he will not survive, and is, consistent with his prior attitudes towards life and death in the wild, rather accepting of his fate. He tells Snitter that he had not thought hunters would be out after such a cold night, but, as is the way of the wild, "I was wrong. A Todd only has to be wrong once, you know." He admits that he fears the pain of death, but accepts that, in the dark, there will be no more suffering. After leaving his former partner with some encouraging words for Ralph, the Todd hurries off into the mist and is soon overcome by the pack, where he is torn to shreds as a mournful Snitter watches from a distance. Eventually, with another man dying in connection with the dogs, who devour his body afterwards to keep from starving, and with fears rising that the pair may have contracted bubonic plague during their escape from the lab, the military is deployed to the lakeland to hunt the two down and put an end to the panic. As parachutists scour the valley in which they have been dwelling, Ralph and Snitter make a desperate flight to the sea. Ralph was about to answer when Snitter threw up his head and howled, a long cry of anguish and fear. "Snitter, where are those men you talk about? They'll hear you."
"I'm howling for my death. No, it's for yours, poor old Ralph. Yours and the Todd's. I can't remember any more what it was he asked me to say to you. I do so wish I could."
"Gone on till the dark. Well, the Todd's got no more to bother him now."
"I remember one thing he said. He said, 'It's not the dark that frightens me, it's their writhing teeth.' That's how I feel too. I hope it won't hurt."
Snitter paused, nose in the wind. Suddenly he said,
"We've finished being wild animals. That's all finished. So we'll go down now."
Beset on all sides by ranks of armed men, and attempting to remain hidden from patrolling helicopters, the pair end up sheltering on board an old scenic train, which unwittingly takes them towards the shore. As the two dogs watch the landscape passing by with confusion, they reflect on their journey, with the optimistic Snitter finally beginning to come to terms with his old life being forever lost, and the pessimistic Ralph wishing that he had been able to live as a proper dog in service to man. "You know, I was keen to be a good dog, Snitter. I really wanted to be a good dog. I'd have done anything for them. Anything but the metal water."
They weren't real masters, Ralph. They didn't particularly want you to be a good dog. They didn't care what sort of dog you were. I don't know what they did want. I don't believe they knew themselves.
"But surely, Snitter, dogs ought to be able to trust men, oughtn't they?"
"It doesn't matter anymore, old Ralph."
"I know. I'm only saying these things to stop myself jumping up and barking at the things rushing past. I wasn't a good dog. Wish I had been."
Whatever dogs were meant for, they weren't meant for the metal water. If you can't live by rotten rules, you have to find some of your own.
What other rules did we find?
The Todds.
They weren't right for us. We couldn't live by them either.
I know. The truth is I lost my home and you never had one. But it doesn't matter anymore.
But before discussing the finale, where Adams weaves the myriad threads of the story together on the shores of Ravenglass Beach, it is important to address the numerous side stories and the characters involved with them. While the central narrative of the novel concerns the two dogs' attempts to survive in the Lakeland, a number of other subplots are gradually introduced and expanded upon, and here we come to what sets the Plague Dogs apart from Adams' other works. Though Watership Down contained elements of social criticism, with its concern for nature and opposition to excessive land development, the novel was firmly rooted in the modernist literary tradition. Whereas The Plague Dogs, its pages dripping with irony and laden with socio-political critique, is a work of literary postmodernism. The first of these human-centric subplots concerns the laboratory itself, the fictional animal research, scientific and experimental station established in Lawson Park. While no real laboratory has ever existed there, and no individual facility has ever carried out such a wide range of studies, every experiment described in the novel, no matter how cruel or inhumane, is one that has, during at least one point in history, been conducted. From Ralph's drowning tank endurance test to rabbits' eyes being coated with chemicals, from monkeys being sealed in deprivation chambers for months on end, to all forms of mutilation experiments designed to understand how living creatures function and adapt, Adams leaves little to the imagination as he paints vivid pictures of some of the unimaginably cruel experiments carried out in the name of scientific curiosity or the testing of commercial products. Hardly what most people would consider necessary or justified. This style of experimentation was in line with a 1965 report commissioned by the British Home Office Department Committee on Experiments on Animals, which justified any research on non-human animals, no matter what severity or duration of suffering might be inflicted on the creatures involved, as any knowledge gleaned from such experiments might end up benefiting humanity at some later date. Accordingly, we recommend that there should be no general barrier to the use of animal experimentation in seeking new biological knowledge, even if it cannot be shown to be of immediate or foreseeable value. This mindset was quickly adopted by many other countries, and employed throughout the following decades until the inhumane logic behind it gradually crumbled as attitudes shifted, a change to which this novel certainly contributed. When Ralph and Snitter make their way through the laboratory during their escape, they pass through a number of rooms full of various experiments, each of which finds itself in the crosshairs of Adams' biting wit. When the two encounter an aviary full of mutilated pigeons, who have had various limbs or organs amputated or maimed in experiments designed to determine the nature and origins of their homing ability, Adams writes, "The results of all the experiments so far had been most informative, yielding the basic information that while some birds succeeded in returning home, others did not. One could draw the firm and valuable conclusions first, that birds whose faculties had been impaired were less swift and competent in getting home than birds whose faculties had not. When passing through a room of monkeys, who are being subjected to horrible conditions in an attempt to understand mortality rates among animals transported by airlines, he ironically notes, the results being carefully noted by Dr. Boycott, who had, in as short a time as 3 months, made the remarkable discovery that overcrowding, rough handling, and prolonged thirst were beyond doubt the major contributors to higher than average death rates occurring among small mammals transported by air. And when the two come to a block housing cats with hoods over their heads, the experiment is described as such. They searched the cat block, where cats were kept permanently in hoods covering their eyes and ears, in order to discover the effect upon cats of being kept permanently in hoods covering their eyes and ears. Later on, during one of the human-centric interludes between Ralph and Snitter's story, the character Stephen Powell, a researcher at the Lawson Park station, is reviewing the results of a study where beagles are exposed to excessive amounts of cigarette smoke. Tobacco companies attempting to develop non-carcinogenic products have commissioned the study, which has failed miserably, as every one of the dogs developed lung cancer and was subsequently euthanized. After establishing the details of the study, which occurred in real life, Adams sarcastically writes, "Of course, it was open to people to give up smoking, but this would plainly be an intolerable demand to make, as long as experiments on living and sentient animals held out a chance of something better." Even the name of the facility, Animal Research, Scientific and Experimental Station at Lawson Park, contains an element of mockery, as its acronym, ARSE, is a British and Commonwealth English slang term equivalent to the American ass. Such satire is employed right from the opening scene. When Stephen Powell is attempting to remove an unconscious Ralph from the metal tank after allowing the dog to struggle for hours, he complains of having a sore wrist. His superior Dr. Boycott then steps in to help, replying, "I wouldn't want you to suffer unavoidably." But Adams does more than simply criticize cruel experimentation, wielding the various side plots like weapons in his satirical arsenal as he embarks on broader critiques of government, bureaucracy, the media, and contemporary society at large. The first of these concerns the characters at the laboratory themselves. Harry Tyson, one of the animal caretakers at the facility, is the first to discover the dog's escape, and quickly covers up his own negligence in leaving the door to their pen unfastened by sabotaging the spring mechanism. Tyson ends up letting it slip to some friends that two dogs manage to escape, and later on, his own superiors, including Stephen Powell and Dr. Boycott, begin to receive calls from concerned and angry local farmers when sheep turn up dead. The laboratory personnel initially deny their awareness of any escape, hoping that the dogs will either starve or be shot. But as pressure mounts, they eventually put out a nondescript statement that 2 dogs escaped, and allow for people higher up in the government to get dragged in. The irony is that, by this time, at least 4 figures in the lab have covered up mistakes to some degree, but each of them remains preoccupied with harboring suspicions about the others and allowing the blame to pass them by. Even so, Adams' portrayal of the laboratory figures is not one-dimensional, a facet most evident in the character of Stephen Powell, the assistant to Dr. Boycott at Lawson Park. Originally regarding the animals as nothing more than laboratory equipment, over the course of the novel, Powell begins to sympathize with them, in particular with the monkey subjected to an isolation and deprivation experiment. In the wake of the controversies surrounding the lab, the operating budget is reduced, and certain personnel are shuffled around, including Powell, who decides to release the traumatized monkey and bring it home with him. Here, near the novel's end, it is revealed that his daughter is dying of an unspecified disease to which there is currently no known cure, and that he had taken his job at the lab in hopes that he might work his way up to becoming involved with research regarding her condition. In this way, Richard Adams makes it clear that his opposition is not to all medical research conducted using animals, but specifically on the frivolous, wasteful, pointless, and unnecessarily cruel experiments portrayed in the novel. At the top of the chain of responsibility is British Cabinet Minister William Harbottle, who serves as Secretary of State of the Department of the Environment. Hot Bottle Bill, as he is known among his subordinates, begins facing increasing pressure on the subject of the escaped dogs as the media latches onto the story. He, like almost everyone else, attempts to deflect blame, while the political opposition jumps at the chance to use this latest blunder to question whether the research expenditures he approved of are being properly used. As an elected official, Harbottle is quick to attempt to delegate authority to bureaucrats who are not subject to recall by the public. In one such instance, where, after being challenged, Bill quickly retreats and tells an underling to deal with the problem, Adams mockingly notes that Hot Bottle Bill was not a British cabinet minister for nothing. In the end, after much delay and inaction, and after rampant media speculation generates panic over concerns that the dogs might have been exposed to the plague during their escape, the government's response is to deploy a battalion of the Parachute Regiment to the Lakeland. But even then, as Secretary Harbottle arrives to supervise the operation, Adams makes it clear that the minister's first priority is his own political career. As he stammers to a reporter during a surprise impromptu interview, I believe public peace of mind positively requires. After the death of Mr. Ephraim in connection with the dogs, larger media organizations began to take note of the story, including the fictional tabloid magazine, The London Orator. In one interlude, the owner and his editorial staff discuss dispatching one of their reporters to the Lakeland to cover the developing story, but it quickly becomes apparent that their chief concern is not informing the public, but rather generating controversy in order to both make money and embarrass the current government. As they debate whether or not the story about sheep killings and the death of Mr. Ephraim will last long, and will therefore be worth investing time and effort into covering, one of their editors counters that even if there is no story, their best reporter can create one. As evidence, he reminds the rest of the team of a prior minor scandal that the Orator was able to blow out of proportion to incense the public and thereby boost sales, callously remarking that it was cheap at the price of 2 suicides, wasn't it? Adams' mocking scorn for the vulturine tendencies of many modern journalists is best embodied in the character of Digby Driver, the star reporter of the London Orator, whose highly clever and extremely amoral covering of the dog's story greatly exacerbates the situation. Driver himself was a product of a broken home, abandoned by his father before birth and his mother shortly afterward, and raised by a grandmother unprepared to take on the challenge at such a late stage in life. Deriding the idea, increasingly accepted in his time, that children should be reared free from any discipline and allowed as much reign as possible, Adams writes that, thanks to his circumstances and to various ideas current among well-meaning people in the fields of child psychology, social welfare, and state education, he also grew up without respect or fear for parents, since he knew none, for God, of whom, or of whose son, for that matter, he knew even less, or for the school authorities, who were prevented by law from subjecting him to any effective restraint or discipline. For his elders, he grew up having about as much respect as has a baboon. That is, he respected them to the extent that they were able to harm or to exercise power over him. Richard Adams, an Orthodox Christian raised in a very stable, traditional upper-middle-class household and instilled with discipline at a prestigious boarding school, looked upon the increasingly fractious and volatile nature of ordinary households in Britain and across the secularizing Western world with dismay, seeing this disillusion of the family as one of the premier causes of worsening social problems. Digby Driver embodies what the author saw as the increasingly likely product of such a decaying, hedonistic, atomized society, a highly capable, narcissistic sociopath who has no qualms about jeopardizing the well-being of others or violating traditional notions of integrity or virtue. Handed a rich cultural heritage, Driver squanders it in the short-sighted and narrow-minded pursuit of personal gain, a nature alluded to in his frequent quotation, often misapplied or ironically used, of famous biblical passages that he has merely absorbed via social osmosis. Even before he has reached the Lakeland, Driver is already contemplating how he will best turn the situation to his advantage by inflaming the public, and proudly recalling previous incidents where he manipulated, or even fabricated, narratives to increase sales. After arriving on the scene, Driver is quick to extract information from a shaken Stephen Powell and an embittered Harry Tyson, and writes, without confirmation, that the sheep killings have been tied to the lab escapees. Aided by accomplices back in the London office, he eventually discerns that one of the scientists at Lawson Park is a former German bioweapons researcher who came to Britain after World War II. After tracking down and blackmailing the man into revealing that research on the bubonic plague was carried out at Lawson Park, Driver then goes on to report that the dogs may, and later definitely are, carrying the plague, hence the novel's title. But Adams does seem to hold out some hope for Driver, and others like him. For as his coverage of the hunt progresses, and his own wild exaggerations and outright lies draw ever more people into the desperate pursuit, Driver begins to sympathize with the dogs as he digs into their pasts. Eventually, his coverage draws the attention of one Alan Wood, a man critically injured and still recovering after being hit by a truck, who claims to be the owner of one of the dogs, Snitter. In a rather abrupt change of heart, Driver makes the decision to aid Alan as the novel rushes toward its climax on the shores of Ravenglass Beach. In the end, cornered against the crashing waves, Ralph and Snitter are forced to take to the mist-shrouded sea. A terrified Ralph considers this to be a vast drowning tank, but his friend urges him on, describing a mythical Isle of Dog where they can find refuge. "Snitter, I won't go back in the tank. I won't go back in the tank." Ralph ran a few yards into the waves and returned, a great, shaggy dog whining and trembling in the wind. "What's out there, Snitter, in the water?"
"There's an island," said Snitter desperately. "Didn't you know? A wonderful island. The Star Dog runs it. There are all dogs there."
The two splash into the water and vanish in the mist as the soldiers open fire, and by the time Snitter's master arrives with the reporter who began the plague rumor, the dogs have vanished from sight. Thus we come to what Adams originally envisioned as the story's inevitable end.
"Can't any more, Ralph."
"Bite onto me, Snitter, bite."
"Cold."
"The island, Snitter, the Isle of Dog. We must get there."
"Cold. Tired."
No feeling in the legs. Cold. Cold. Longing to rest. Longing to stop. Losing 2 gasps in every 3 for a lungful of air. The stinging, muzzle-slapping water. Rocking up and down. This isn't a dream. It's real. Real. We're going to die. "I'm sorry, Snitter, about the Todd. All my fault."
"That's it. Remember, Todd, tell you. Read Mesa."
"What?"
"Read Mesa. Yows."
Cold. Sinking. Bitter, choking dark. As Snitter finally breaks through the delusions gripping his mind, remembering the Todd's parting words of kindness for Ralph, praising his sheep-killing ability, his pessimistic friend attempts to give him the strength to carry on, before both are overcome by exhaustion in the depths of the cold, roaring waters. And now, before discussing the true ending, we come to the topic of philosophical pessimism, an offshoot of existential nihilism, or the position that life has no intrinsic value. Philosophical pessimists take this line of reasoning further, arguing that life itself, particularly conscious existence, is a negative, that suffering is intrinsic to existence, both in terms of physical pain and mental anguish, and that this suffering is ultimately pointless. Or, as Ralph puts it repeatedly throughout the course of the novel, in far simpler terms, it's a bad world for animals. As conscious beings capable of contemplating the past and future, we are made aware of our own inevitable mortality, all the while constantly forced to maintain ourselves lest we succumb to it. And while advances may be made in terms of science, medicine, technology, and politics, new problems continue to arise for all the old ones that are solved. But most importantly, while we are driven to seek pleasure in its various forms, any sense of fulfillment is lost immediately upon its attainment, leaving us, as the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer described, swinging on a pendulum between boredom and suffering, or the states of emptiness and want. Consider, in contrast, the life of a wild animal, free to simply eat, sleep, and reproduce, with no worries other than those aroused by the presence of immediate danger. While a wild animal in its natural state will know fear from time to time, and endure deprivation, it does not suffer anguish over attempting to find meaning, or anxiety over awareness of its inevitable death until the moments immediately before it. This dichotomy between the conscious, sapient existence of man and the primal nature of other animals is analogized through Adams' portrayal of the dogs in his story, who come with an ingrained notion of a sense of purpose, to serve man, sharing their suffering in the manner described in Ralph's story of the Star Dog, where mankind is cursed to be aware of their mortality, and therefore alienated from the natural world. Upon meeting the Todd, the two attempt to shed this domesticity, liberating themselves from the demands of a conscious existence to live in the moment, like wild animals. Suddenly, a great flame of abandonment crackled up in the thorny tangle of Snitter's mind. He could be done with care. He, too, could become burdened with no name, no past, no future, with no regret, no memory, no loss, no fear but caution, no longing but appetite, no misery but bodily pain. No part of his self need be exposed except awareness of the present, and that gone in an instant, like a fly snapped at in mist on a summer afternoon. He saw himself, bold and wary, floating on life, needing nothing, obedient only to cunning and instinct, creeping through the bracken upon the quarry, vanishing from pursuers like a shadow, sleeping secure in hiding, gambling again and again until at last he lost, and then departing, with a shrug and a grin, to make way for some other trickster nameless as himself. This notion of the conscious mind never being satisfied, always longing for more as every supposed solution brings new problems with it, is addressed in one of the earliest chapters, just after the two dogs escape from the laboratory. After Ralph and Snitter flee into the night, Richard Adams begins the very next page with a dialogue on freedom, in which he muses on its deceptive draw. Freedom, that consuming goal above doubt or criticism, desired as moths desire the candle. Would to God we had never encountered you, for we are free, free to suffer every anguish of deliberation, of decisions which must be made upon suspect information and half-knowledge, every anguish of hindsight and regret, of failure, shame, and responsibility for all that we have brought upon ourselves and others, free to struggle, to starve, to demand from all one last, supreme effort to reach where we long to be and, once there, to conclude that it is not, after all, the right place. He concludes this dialogue by ironically considering that the tyrant wasn't such a bad old bugger, for at least in servitude one's needs had been provided for. But he acknowledges that, having tasted freedom, there is no going back. This can not only be seen as allegorical to the dog's plight, who, upon attaining freedom, must now fend for themselves and face starvation and the elements, but also of humanity as a whole. Having lost our wild, primitive status upon reaching sapience, we are now free to suffer in ways that a lower beast cannot. An additional, crucial component of pessimistic philosophy is the belief that no metaphysical reality, such as God, exists to overcome the suffering of the physical world. Many theistic philosophers agree with their pessimistic counterparts on a number of assumptions about existence, including the fallen or corrupted nature of our reality. But for those who believe in the divine, the existence of a supreme being and perfect state beyond the suffering of physical reality not only offers humanity meaning, but justifies any temporary suffering we must endure in this life. But if this life is all there is, then what does that mean if conscious existence is composed primarily of either empty boredom or meaningless pain? And in a world where scientific advancements have shaken many traditionally held notions about the nature of the world, and our conceptions of God and the truthfulness of religion, what does this mean for humanity going forward? Throughout the novel, Adams makes frequent use of the line, "lost dog seeking vanished man," which I interpret as allegorical for humans in an increasingly secular world, desperately, and perhaps hopelessly, attempting to fill the void in their lives left by the absence of religious belief. The famed psychologist and philosopher Carl Jung argued that human beings are naturally inclined towards some manner of religious belief. And if that is true, where does that leave us when our fundamental assumptions about the universe and our place within it are eroded before an increasingly grim, nihilistic rationalism? Following this line of interpretation, Snitter can be viewed as someone previously religious who has lost their faith in God, while Ralph never had it to begin with. The Todd, on the other hand, is a true wild animal, never bothering to consider such grand notions. Richard Adams was quite familiar with Xenofiction, and seeing as humans have been described as akin to gods to dogs since as early as Jack London's White Fang, it would follow that Snitter desperately seeking his vanished man could be equated with hoping to recapture a lost sense of religious faith and purpose, even as Ralph derides such ideas as childish. At the end of the novel, as the dogs ride a train towards the sea, Ralph and Snitter reflect upon their journey. Snitter, formerly the optimist, appears to have finally conceded that they will never find a master, or any good life. When Ralph says that dogs should be able to trust man, and that he wishes he could have been good, Snitter replies, "If you can't live by rotten rules, you have to find some of your own." Ralph then asks what rules they found, to which his friend answers, "The Todd's, the rules of a wild beast." And when Ralph says that they couldn't live by those either, the ever-optimistic Snitter, seemingly having finally given up hope, heartbreakingly replies, "I know. The truth is I lost my home and you never had one. But it doesn't matter anymore." It must be noted that, as an Orthodox Christian, Richard Adams himself did not subscribe to pessimistic philosophy, But even so, his wartime experiences left a profound impact on his worldview. In exploring how a supposedly benevolent God could allow such suffering to exist in the world, Adams ties his novel thematically to the biblical Book of Job, arguably the most profound, and widely misunderstood, book of the Old Testament. In it, we are presented with the figure of Job, a devout man who enjoys many blessings, including wealth, land, and a large family with numerous servants and livestock. As God is attended to by his angels in heaven, Satan arrives among them. The former accusingly asks the latter if he is aware of Job, one of God's most righteous and devoted servants, but his counterpart charges that Job is only pious because of his prosperity. God then gives Satan power over Job's life, in order to test the man, whereupon Job's children, servants, and livestock are killed, and his possessions are stolen or destroyed. Initially, Job refuses to condemn God for his misfortune. Even as his wife urges him to curse God and die, Job responds with a rhetorical question: shall we receive only good from God, and not evil as well? Essentially arguing that we as humans should not expect life to be comprised solely of enjoyment. But the book doesn't end there. Job's suffering continues, progressing to physical torment, and his attitude gradually sours. Job begins to long for death, even going so far as to wish that he had never been born. When his friends accuse him of having brought his suffering upon himself through some secret sin, Job finally lashes out not only at them but at God himself, accusing the Creator of being unjust, excessively cruel, and even negligent in allowing the wicked to so often triumph over and torment the innocent. In the story's climax, God appears to Job as an all-encompassing whirlwind, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of any of Job's claims made against him, replying to the man's fury with the retort, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world?" Instead of acknowledging the injustice, God casts his own omniscience and omnipotence against the frail, limited nature of Job and of all existence. Job, humbly accepting his place as a limited, mortal creature, then rescinds his grievances. Therefore, I find myself reprehensible, and repent in dust and ashes, and the blessings of his former life are restored to him. Ultimately, while the story of Job's torment presents serious ethical problems for those subscribing to a viewpoint of biblical literalism, when viewed from a less fundamentalist angle, it can be seen as one of the earliest attempts of Western theologians to come to terms with the suffering inherent in existence, and to reconcile that nature with the concept of a benevolent God, or more broadly, with life as something worth living. And its ending, where the transcendent God sets right the wrongs of the physical world, is also mirrored in the conclusion of The Plague Dogs. Originally, Richard Adams had intended for the novel to end with the dogs drowning at sea, a bleak, pessimistic conclusion to an already grueling exploration of suffering. But his editor and several early manuscript readers all prevailed upon him to provide a happy ending for his characters, and in response, he included a poem and epilogue, both of which highlight another of the postmodernist aspects of the novel, the author's recognition within the text of its nature as a story. The next page begins with the note, "Here ensueth the colloquy between the author and his reader." In it, Adams presents a brief colloquy, or conversation, in the form of a poem, anticipating and responding to the audience's reception of his bleak ending. When the readers insist that such an ending is unthinkable, Adams initially responds that such is the way of the world. But after hearing their pleas, and their claim that ours is not that monstrous world, the author relents. We are then introduced to a pair of naturalists, Adams' longtime friend Ronald Lockley, whose book on wild rabbits proved instrumental in providing an air of realism to Watership Down, as well as the famed Sir Peter Scott, both of whom agreed to be featured in the novel after reading the manuscript. As the two row out to sea, they end up coming across a nearly drowned Ralph and Snitter, rescuing the two dogs and bringing them to shore. Snitter is then reunited with his master, who agrees to take in Ralph as well, and Snitter, thinking that the pair have died and reached the mythical Isle of Dog, remarks, "Oh, Snit's a good dog. Come to that, Ralph's a good dog too." Like Job, Ralph begins by believing that his suffering at the hands of a higher power, in his case mankind, is justified as the proper state of existence. However, as it not only continues but worsens, and as his attempts at improving his lot in life fail, he grows increasingly bitter and vengeful, eventually condemning all mankind as Job does God, only to recant upon being delivered from his suffering by a higher power, in this case good human beings. This happy ending reinforces Adam's ultimate belief that, whatever horrors we may endure in this life, such suffering is temporary compared to the eternal goodness of God, and that the nature of existence is fundamentally proper. And this, partially, is what makes the novel's 1982 animated adaptation so fascinating. After their 1978 rendition of Watership Down saw widespread acclaim and earned several times its budget, Martin Rosen and Nepenthe Productions set to work adapting the novel's spiritual successor shortly thereafter. But given the sprawling nature of Adam's postmodern masterpiece, and the difficulties with portraying much of it in a single film, the decision was made to strip the story down to its essentials. While enough material from the myriad side plots was retained to allow the main narrative to function, the movie discards Adam's biting social commentary in favor of focusing on the plight of Ralph and Snitter, as well as their on-again, off-again Vulpine companion. Where the novel includes numerous scenes of both local humans and scientists at the lab grappling with the aftermath of the dog's escape, these are typically relegated to transition scenes in the movie, and in many cases simply feature relevant human dialogue over shots of the dogs traveling.
There's some bloody beast or other living up there. There is that. 2 sheep inside 8 or 9 days.
Where'd you find them?
Telling this Williamson that we have nothing to say was exactly the right line to take.
He's going to think that's very suspicious. And what about Tyson?
I've already had a word with Tyson. The most he can say, if he's asked, is that 2 pens were found empty.
Whereas Digby Driver provides a vehicle for Adams to scathingly satirize the media in his novel, the film adaptation takes a much more subdued approach, with reporter Lynn Driver seeming to be genuinely interested in informing the public and getting the facts straight. And while it is tempting to be disappointed by the changes made, and perhaps wish for a longer miniseries that could have adapted the novel in its entirety, these alterations ultimately serve to make the central narrative all the more powerful, working extremely efficiently with such a limited runtime. As with the 1978 version of Watership Down, the 1982 adaptation of The Plague Dogs features beautiful hand-painted background art, often composed of multiple layers to give a sense of depth. Clouds drift in the sky, carrion birds flit from branch to branch, stars sparkle overhead and reflect off of pools of water, and blood trickles down into the streams running over the fells. Character designs, be they for the main trio or the scientists, shepherds, farmers, and wildlife that populate the lakeland, are also rendered in as realistic a manner as possible, and the camera work helps to further the sense of the dog's fugitive nature, as human faces are almost never shown directly, often being obscured by sterile laboratory lights or cloaked in shadow when they are not out of frame entirely. All of this is underlaid by Patrick Gleason's eclectic and eerie score, where industrial synthesizers maintain a sense of dread and foreboding, evoking the alien nature of the land in which the escaped dogs find themselves trying to survive. But perhaps even more important than any of these is the voice acting. Much of the cast is peopled by actors familiar with the rugged Geordie dialect of the Lakeland, which helps to further convey a sense of realism as we listen in on conversations in pubs or watch shepherds and their dogs at work.
Aren't I start bloody mad or what?
We just need a master.
Just need a master?
Ralph is played by Christopher Benjamin, who provides a gruff, wounded voice, possessed of an edge that hints at the violence his character often resorts to.
I can't stand the water anymore. When I shut my eyes, water comes again. Suppose there aren't any masters left. What then?
There must be. It's just that I wasn't expecting this.
Snitter, meanwhile, is voiced by John Hurt, who provided the voice for the protagonist Hazel in Watership Down. And once again, he does an excellent job at portraying one of Adam's beloved characters. His leathery, pondersome delivery matches the eccentric, poetic nature of Snitter's speech, managing to sound at once vulnerable, optimistic, and exhausted by his experiences.
Listen. The door's not a wall anymore. The tobacco man lit it with his matches. Can you smell it burning? Look how the wind sends the leaves running across the sky. This isn't the world I left when I was sold to the Whitecoats. Must have changed when I killed my master. Everything I do turns out wrong. Look out there. It's our island. Don't you see it?
The third protagonist, the enigmatic and wily Todd, is voiced by James Bolam, who, like his counterparts, does a brilliant job of bringing to life the character whose lilting rogues jargon Adams described and employed in the novel. Bolam's voice matches the sharp, biting wit and opportunistic demeanor of the Todd perfectly.
Stay where you are. I mean it.
Oh, we're no kidder. No need for you and me to start battling.
Where are you going?
Oh, I'm just going to bark at the farmer's door. Maybe he'll let me shove me head up his gun. Save a lot of bother, that will.
You're no dog at all now. You're a sheep killer. They'll blast your arse out, Hinny. No trouble. I tell you, we'd best be off or you'll both be dead or dying inside half an hour.
Very little from the bulk of the main narrative was overtly changed, though elements of both Ralph's and the Todd's character were altered in the process of adaptation. Ralph is generally kinder and more patient with his friend, his outbursts of anger rarer and less severe, while the Todd, despite joining and leaving the pair several times over the course of the movie, as the dog's fortunes change, returns to them in the end. Instead of being run down by foxhounds after a chance encounter with Snitter, in the movie the Todd scares a hunter into falling off the ledge of Dow Crag, doubly saving his starving companions. He then rejoins the two, aiding their escape as the parachute regiment is deployed to the Lakeland, finally parting with them in a rather selfless attempt at distracting the military's tracking dogs so that Ralph and Snitter might have a chance to flee the valley unnoticed.
This is where we part, me old mates. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve that ought to surprise him. Now away, lads, and do as I said. Straight across the valley and up the other side. I'll be too busy with me to bother with you.
When the fox appears to have shaken his pursuers, he is suddenly ambushed, suffering a leg wound before being cornered and killed. The biggest change, however, comes with the ending. As Ralph and Snitter are cornered by the military on the shores of Ravenglass Beach, Snitter claims that he sees an island out amidst the waves, an island all for themselves, where the two can live happy and free. Ralph follows him into the water, and the pair are fired upon as mist suddenly envelops them. In the final scene, the two are still struggling out to sea sometime later, each battling their growing exhaustion. When Ralph eventually asks about the island, Snitter, in a moment of clarity, finally sees through the delusions that have plagued him for so long, recognizing that it was merely a hallucination.
We must be near the island.
There isn't any island, Ralph.
Ralph almost certainly knows this, having had to deal with Snitter's damaged mind for some time. But in their final moments together, he instead chooses to encourage his friend, telling him,
There is. There. Can't you see it? Our island.
And in the final line, which was bizarrely trimmed from the truncated American release, but thankfully preserved in the original cut, Ralph tells his friend,
Just stay with me. I'll get you there.
While the optimistic ending of the novel, in which benevolent humans appear from the mist to save our heroes and deliver them back to the care of a loving master, may be much happier and more cathartic to audiences, the film, which instead opts for Adam's original ending, is far more realistic. Instead of a miraculous rescue, Ralph and Snitter are last seen fading into the cold, mist-shrouded sea, where they will almost certainly succumb to exhaustion and drown. Where Adam's novel embraces the optimistic philosophy of his Christian faith, the film seems to choose the much bleaker, and arguably more rational, viewpoint of pessimism. But even so, the adaptation contains certain hopeful takeaways. In addition to Patrick Gleason's score for the film, a song was recorded by English singer Alan Price. Time and Tide is a gospel-inspired track that rises from a slow, somber piano melody to a triumphant, celebratory chorus. It begins with the lines,
I don't feel no pain no more. I don't feel no pain no more. I've left this cruel world behind, and I've found my peace of mind. I don't feel no pain no more.
Which quite clearly reference death as the cessation of suffering. From here, when it shifts to a more upbeat tone and tempo, its lyrics appear to hint at a joyous arrival in heaven.
Yes, I know I'm going home. Yes, I know I'm going home. When I reach the end, you know I'll find a friend. Yes, I know I'm going home.
In the jubilant climax, the song echoes some of the sentiments of pessimistic philosophy with regards to living in the moment.
I'm tired of flowing over me. I once was blind, but now I see. The answer lies within your heart. Never is about the past. The present time will never last. The future lies within your heart.
The somber piano melody and almost whisper-like vocals play in the film's opening scene, just before Ralph bursts above the surface of the tank's water in a final attempt to avoid drowning. And as I mentioned earlier, this imagery can be seen as a twisted allegory for birth, with the constricting, watery interior being likened to a corrupted womb, from which Ralph is born into a world of suffering. But in the end, he, and Snitter alongside him, return to the water. Only this time it is not the narrow, sterile interior of the tank, but the vastness of the ocean, often used as an allegory for the totality of existence, where the pair will meet their fate. And here, when the two drift off into the mist, the song begins to play in its entirety as an island emerges from the haze. While some interpret this as Snitter's island being real, allowing the dogs to have a happy ending after all, such a conclusion would be essentially as miraculous, and therefore unrealistic, as the ending of the original novel. But given the lyrics of the song playing, and the mysterious manner in which Snitter describes the island he and Ralph are supposedly heading towards, I think it's fairly clear that the island is intended as a metaphor for heaven, a perfect state in which we are free from suffering, united with the totality of existence. But even if this is merely symbolic imagery, not truly representative of reality, even if, as Ralph says when quoting the Todd, "When you're dead, and there is nothing more to or beyond this life," the ending of the film still contains a glimmer of hope. All three of the main characters make a significant change for the better before meeting their inevitable ends, suggesting that improvement, while not managing to change our ultimate fate as mortal creatures, can make our lives more bearable for the time we are here. The Todd, introduced as a self-serving rogue without allegiance to any other living creature, ends up giving his life to buy his friends time to escape. Snitter, battling with delusions and psychosis after his traumatic brain operation, who often struggles to perceive the real world around him, is able to finally recognize the truth before the end. And Ralph, the laboratory-born pessimist who cannot bring himself to share Snitter's faith in humanity, who has never known a world that did not want to see him suffer, chooses in his final moments to provide his friend with reassurance and comfort in the face of death. While both the novel and film versions of Watership Down suggest that the key to triumphing over mortality lies in ensuring that one's descendants live to carry on their legacy, and the Plague Dogs novel implies that our only hope rests in placing faith in a benevolent God, the latter's film adaptation instead appears to argue that any attempt at defeating death will inevitably prove futile, and that perhaps our best option is to simply choose to face the suffering of the world alongside those we love. As the film's final line reads, "Just stay with me. I'll get you there."